Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where the quiet places of the world have the most to say, if you are willing to slow down long enough to listen. There is something particular about a stretch of water that looks ordinary, not the deep, dramatic ocean of adventure films, not a roaring cataract or a famous reef, just grey water, cold and relatively shallow under an overcast sky. The kind of place you might glance at from a window seat and think, well, that does not look so bad. And that perhaps is exactly the problem. The most dangerous places are not always the ones that announce themselves. Sometimes they are the ones that seem unremarkable right up until they are not. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with one of those places, a stretch of open water in the southern part of Australia, between the mainland and the island of Tasmania, known as Bass Strait. It is not especially wide, it is not especially deep. It carries regular ferry traffic, fishing vessels, cargo ships and light aircraft on a daily basis. And yet, over the course of more than 2 centuries, it has accumulated a record of disappearances, wrecks and unexplained events that has led some people to give it a name that echoes one of the most famous maritime mysteries in the world. Some call it the Bass Strait Triangle. We're going to take that name seriously tonight, and we're also going to examine it carefully. Because there is a real story here, a story built on documented history, physical geography, genuine tragedy, and in at least one case, a mystery that investigators officially left open with the words, "cause unknown." And there are also layers of folklore and media narrative that have been added on top of that real story over the decades. Part of what makes Bass Strait interesting is figuring out which is which. Before we get into any of that, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you right now as you listen to this? It is one of those questions I find myself genuinely curious about, because this channel tends to reach people in very different places and very different moments. Maybe you are in bed somewhere in Australia, close enough to have actually seen Bass Strait from a plane window or a ferry deck. Maybe you're on the other side of the world entirely, somewhere in Europe or North America, where the southern Australian coastline is about as distant as a place can get. And what is the temperature where you are? Is it cold outside your window, the kind of cold that makes the idea of open grey water feel even more uncomfortable? Or is it warm and still, and Bass Strait is purely an idea, a story carried through a speaker in the dark? I ask because I think where you are shapes how you hear a story like this one. The Strait is a real place, and the people who live near it, who cross it regularly on the Spirit of Tasmania ferry or fly over it in small planes on their way to King Island, they have a relationship with it that is different from the relationship of someone hearing about it for the first time. Both ways of encountering it are valid, but it is worth knowing which one you are in tonight. If this kind of storytelling is something you enjoy, something calm and detailed and built around real places and real events, I would gently ask that you consider subscribing to the channel if you have not already, and leaving a like on this video if it feels right. It genuinely helps the channel reach more people who might want to sit with stories like this one, and it helps me keep making them. There is no pressure, just a quiet request, and then we move on. Now, Bass Strait. Let us start with the geography, because the geography is everything here. The strait separates the state of Victoria, which is the southeastern corner of mainland Australia, from the island of Tasmania, which sits roughly 240 kilometres to the south at the narrowest crossing point. That 240 kilometres is the figure that matters most for understanding the strait's character. It is far enough that you cannot see the other side. It is far enough that a small vessel or a light aircraft is genuinely committed once it is out there. But it is also close enough that people sometimes treat the crossing as routine, as a short hop rather than a serious passage. That gap between perception and reality has contributed to more than a few disasters. The depth of the strait is something that surprises people when they first look at the numbers. The average depth across much of Bass Strait is somewhere between 50 and 70 metres. In some areas, particularly over the Bassian Plain, which is the broad, relatively flat expanse of the continental shelf that forms the strait's floor, the depth is even shallower. There are banks and shoals scattered throughout, some of them barely below the surface, and the waters around King Island and the Furneaux group of islands to the east are threaded through with reefs that have been catching ships since the first European vessels began crossing the strait in the late 1700s. Now, 50 to 70 metres might sound like plenty of water, and in calm conditions, it is. But the behaviour of water in a storm is fundamentally different when it's shallow compared to when it is deep, and this is one of the key physical facts about Bass Strait that does not get enough attention in the popular accounts. In deep ocean, waves have room to develop long rolling periods. They are still dangerous, but they have a kind of regularity to them. In shallow water, the same energy produces waves with shorter periods and steeper faces, waves that break more readily, that can come from multiple directions at once when the bottom topography is uneven, and that behave in ways that are genuinely harder for vessels to manage. The strait is shallow enough to be a problem, and open enough to give the wind and swell room to build, and the wind. The wind is central to understanding Bass Strait. The Roaring Forties is a name that sailors have used for centuries to describe the band of persistent westerly winds that circles the southern hemisphere between roughly 40 and 50 degrees south latitude. These winds are strong, consistent, and largely unobstructed because there is very little land in the southern hemisphere at those latitudes to slow them down. They build across thousands of kilometres of open southern ocean before they reach the southern coast of Australia. And Bass Strait sits almost exactly in the path of those winds. The strait acts like a funnel, compressing and channeling the Roaring Forties through a relatively narrow gap between the Australian continent and Tasmania. The result is a body of water that can go from manageable to genuinely ferocious in a short period of time, and that carries a baseline level of wind and swell that makes it uncomfortable even on a good day. There is also the cold. The water temperature in Bass Strait is low, even in summer, because the Southern Ocean feeds into it from the west and south. Cold water matters for survival. A person who ends up in Bass Strait in a maritime emergency has a much shorter window than someone who ends up in warmer waters. Hypothermia becomes a factor quickly. This is not a dramatic detail for its own sake. It is a practical reality that has shaped the outcome of many of the events we will talk about tonight. What strikes me about all of this when you lay it out together is that Bass Strait does not look the way a dangerous place is supposed to look. It is not deep. It is not remote in the way that the open Pacific is remote. You can see the Victorian coastline from parts of it on a clear day. There are lighthouses. There are weather stations. It has been a busy maritime corridor for over 200 years. And yet it keeps, with a kind of patient regularity, swallowing things. Ships and planes and people, sometimes with enough wreckage left behind to piece together what happened, and sometimes with almost nothing at all. That is the texture of the place we are spending tonight with. Not a dramatic abyss, not a supernatural void, just a cold, grey, shallow, busy stretch of water that has been behaving this way for as long as people have been crossing it. The name Bass Strait comes from George Bass, a British naval surgeon and explorer who, along with Matthew Flinders, became the first Europeans to prove that Tasmania was an island and not part of the Australian mainland. That was in 1798 and 1799, and we will come back to that story in more detail shortly, because the history of the strait is not separate from the history of its dangers. They developed together from the very beginning. What I want to leave you with at the end of this opening is a simple image. Imagine standing on the southern coast of Victoria, somewhere around Cape Otway, or Wilson's Promontory, on a grey afternoon in late autumn. The wind is coming from the west, steady and cold. The sea is not particularly rough by Bass Strait standards, but it is not calm either. There is a low swell running, and the water has that particular dark colour that cold, shallow seas get, somewhere between grey and green. You can see the white of breaking waves on some of the offshore reefs, and somewhere out there, 240 kilometres to the south, is Tasmania, invisible behind the horizon and the weather. Every ship that has ever gone down in that water, every plane that has ever gone silent over it started somewhere like that. A dock, a runway, a harbour. Someone checked the weather, filed a plan or made a decision, and then they went out into that grey space. Most of them made it. Thousands of crossings happen every year without incident. But the ones that did not make it, those are the cases that have accumulated over 2 centuries into something that people eventually felt needed a name. And the name they gave it, and the stories attached to it, and the real history underneath those stories, that is where we are going next. George Bass and Matthew Flinders were both young men when they made their most important journey. Bass was 26, Flinders 23. They had already completed a smaller exploratory trip together in a tiny open boat called the Tom Thumb, which gives you some sense of the kind of people they were. Not cautious men exactly. Ambitious, curious, willing to go out into uncertain water in a vessel that most sensible people would not take very far from shore. In 1798 they set out from Port Jackson, which is Sydney Harbour, in a sloop called the Norfolk. The question they were trying to answer was a practical one. Was there a passage of open water between the southern coast of the Australian mainland and the large land mass that the British had been calling Van Diemen's Land, which we now call Tasmania? Nobody had confirmed it either way. The prevailing assumption among many navigators was that the two were connected, or at least that there was no reliable passage between them. Bass and Flinders believed otherwise, based on the behaviour of the swell and the currents they had observed on earlier trips. They were right. They circumnavigated Van Diemen's Land and confirmed that it was an island separated from the mainland by a significant body of open water. Flinders named the passage after his companion, and the name stuck: George Bass Strait, later shortened in common use to Bass Strait. The naming was a formality in a way. The strait had always been there. The Palawa people of Tasmania had been living on both sides of the water for tens of thousands of years, and the archaeological record suggests that during periods of lower sea level, the land that is now submerged beneath the strait was walkable. The rising seas at the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, gradually separated the two land masses, isolating the Tasmanian Aboriginal population from the mainland. That is a long and complicated history that deserves its own careful telling. But for the purposes of the European maritime story, the practical moment begins in 1798, because once Bass and Flinders confirmed the passage, it became immediately valuable. The reason was distance. Before the strait was confirmed as navigable, ships travelling between Sydney and Britain had to round the southern tip of Tasmania and then head north and west, adding significant time and distance to an already very long voyage. Once the strait was established as a usable route, ships could cut straight through it, saving somewhere in the range of a week to several weeks depending on conditions in the specific route. In the early colonial period, when Australia was still entirely dependent on Britain for supplies, equipment, personnel and communication, that time-saving was not a minor convenience. It was economically and strategically significant. The strait became a major commercial corridor almost immediately, and with that volume of traffic came losses. The strait did not wait long to demonstrate what it was capable of. By the early decades of the 19th century, there was already a well-established awareness among mariners that the passage was dangerous, that the weather could deteriorate rapidly, that the reefs around King Island and the Furneaux Group were lethal, and that the shallow water behaved in ways that could overwhelm even experienced crews. The number of vessels lost in the first half of the 19th century alone is considerable, and the records from that period are incomplete. Many smaller vessels that went down left no survivors and no official documentation. They simply stopped arriving. The case that stands above all the others from this early period, the one that still carries the weight of the numbers involved, is the wreck of the Cataraqui. It happened on the 4th of August, 1845, near the western coast of King Island. The Cataraqui was a British emigrant ship, a wooden vessel of around 800 tons carrying settlers from Liverpool to Melbourne. She had 369 passengers on board, mostly Irish and English emigrants, many of them families with children, people who had sold what they had and were making a one-way journey toward what they hoped would be a better life. The crew numbered around 46, so in total, somewhere around 415 people were aboard. The crossing had been difficult. The ship had been at sea for about 3 months, which was not unusual for the period, but the final approach to the Australian coast was made in terrible conditions. The night of August the 3rd was dark and rough, with strong winds and poor visibility. The navigator's calculations of the ship's position were off, which was not uncommon given the technology available at the time and the difficulty of taking accurate readings in bad weather. In the early hours of August the 4th, the Cataraqui struck a reef off the northwest coast of King Island. The impact was catastrophic. The ship began breaking up almost immediately in the heavy surf. What followed was one of the most harrowing maritime disasters in Australian history. The seas were too violent for lifeboats to be launched effectively. People were thrown into the water, swept away, pulled under. A few survivors managed to cling to pieces of wreckage and were eventually washed ashore on King Island. The final death toll was 399 people. 9 crew members and 1 passenger survived. It remains to this day Australia's worst peacetime maritime disaster. The wreck site off King Island is now a protected historic shipwreck under Australian law, and the remains of the vessel lie scattered across the reef in relatively shallow water, still there after nearly 2 centuries. What the Cataraqui disaster did, beyond the immediate human tragedy, was to make the dangers of Bass Strait impossible to ignore at an official level. There had been losses before, many of them, but none on that scale. The disaster prompted serious discussion about navigation aids in the strait, about the need for lighthouses on King Island and other hazardous points, and about the general state of maritime safety on the route. The Cape Wickham Lighthouse, on the northern tip of King Island, was eventually completed in 1861, 16 years after the Cataraqui went down. It stands 48 metres tall, making it the tallest lighthouse in the southern hemisphere, and it was built specifically in response to the pattern of wrecks in those waters. The fact that it took 16 years and many more losses before the lighthouse was built tells you something about the pace at which maritime safety infrastructure developed in the colonial period. The Cataraqui was not the only major wreck of the 1840s in the strait, and it was certainly not the last of the 19th century. The losses continued through the second half of the century, with grim regularity. The Eliza Ramsden went down in 1875. The network of reefs around King Island and the Furneaux Group claimed vessel after vessel. By the end of the 19th century, the waters around King Island alone had accumulated enough wrecks that the island's small community developed an informal relationship with the sea's debris. Timber from wrecked ships was used in local construction. Equipment and cargo that washed ashore was salvaged and repurposed. There is something quietly sobering about that, the way the losses became woven into the practical fabric of island life. The pattern that emerged across the 19th century was not random, in the way that accidents in open ocean tend to be random. It had a geographical logic to it. The western approaches to the strait, the area around King Island, were consistently the most dangerous. Ships coming from the west, from Britain or South Africa, were making landfall after weeks at sea, often with accumulated navigational errors, often in deteriorating weather, and they were approaching a coast that offered very little warning. The reefs did not announce themselves. The water was shallow enough to be dangerous long before a captain might expect it to be, and the roaring 40s pushed everything eastward with a persistence that made it very difficult to hold a course or to heave to safely in a storm. By the time the 20th century began, Bass Strait had already accumulated a documented history of maritime loss that was substantial by any standard. Not mysterious in most of these cases, explicable in the sense that the mechanisms of disaster were clear enough: bad weather, navigational error, inadequate charts, poor visibility, dangerous reefs. The strait was simply a genuinely hazardous place that sat on an important shipping route, and the combination of those two facts produced a long and painful record of loss. That much is history, straightforwardly documented in shipping records, survivor accounts, official inquiries, and the physical evidence that still lies on the seafloor around King Island. But history has a way of accumulating weight, and what happened across the 20th century, particularly from the 1960s onward, was that a new layer of events began to be added to the existing record. Events that were harder to explain cleanly. Events that involved not just the ordinary hazards of wind and reef and navigational error, but circumstances that left investigators without satisfying answers. A pilot whose transmissions described something that no one could account for. A vessel that vanished in conditions that did not obviously explain its loss. A pattern of aviation disappearances that seemed to some observers to exceed what the Strait's known dangers could account for. It is worth being careful here, because the history of Bass Strait from the 19th century is not, in itself, evidence of anything unusual. Dangerous places produce dangerous outcomes. The fact that many ships were lost in the strait across the 1800s does not require any explanation beyond the physical realities we have already discussed. What it does do, though, is establish a baseline. It establishes that this is a place with a long and genuine record of loss, a place where the sea has been taking things for as long as people have been crossing it. That baseline matters when we get to the more puzzling cases, because it means we're not starting from nothing. We're starting from a place that was already known, already documented, already understood to be capable of catastrophic loss. And perhaps that is part of what makes the later, stranger cases feel the way they do. When something disappears over Bass Strait, there is already a kind of weight behind it. A context. 2 centuries of grey water and cold wind and things that went out and did not come back. The strait has a reputation that it earned honestly, through documented loss, long before anyone started calling it a triangle, or comparing it to the waters near Bermuda. The reputation was real before the mythology arrived. It is also worth noting, before we move forward, how the strait's importance shifted across the 20th century. As aviation developed, Bass Strait became a regular flight route as well as a shipping lane. The crossing from the Victorian coast to Tasmania, roughly 240 kilometres at its narrowest, was within range of light aircraft. And as private aviation grew in Australia through the post-war decades, more and more small planes began making the crossing. Charter flights, private pilots, light aircraft carrying passengers and cargo between the mainland and the island. The same geography that had been dangerous for ships turned out to be dangerous for aircraft in its own distinct ways, and the reasons for that are interesting and worth understanding carefully. But before we get to the aviation cases, and particularly before we get to the most famous one, which happened on a clear October evening in 1978 and has never been fully explained to anyone's satisfaction, it helps to understand how the strait came to carry the specific cultural label that it does today. Because at some point in the 1970s and 1980s, the accumulated history of the place, the ships and the planes and the long record of loss, began to be organised in the public imagination under a particular name. A name borrowed, fairly obviously, from a stretch of water in the North Atlantic that had already captured a great deal of popular attention. And the way that name arrived, and what it did to the way people understood the strait's history, is itself a story worth telling carefully. The term Bass Strait Triangle did not arrive quietly, or through any single source. It emerged the way these kinds of labels tend to emerge, gradually, through a combination of journalism, popular books, and the particular cultural appetite of a decade that was unusually interested in unexplained phenomena. The 1970s were, in many ways, a golden era for that kind of interest. The Bermuda Triangle had become a genuine publishing sensation after Charles Berlitz released his book on the subject in 1974, and it sold millions of copies across the English-speaking world. The idea that certain stretches of ocean might behave in ways that defied ordinary explanation had a real grip on the popular imagination, and it was perhaps inevitable that journalists in other countries would begin looking at their own waters with similar questions in mind. In Australia, the comparison to the Bermuda Triangle began appearing in print during the mid to late 1970s. Australian newspapers and magazines started drawing loose parallels between the North Atlantic phenomenon and the pattern of losses in Bass Strait, and the label, once attached, had a way of sticking. It was a useful shorthand. It communicated something immediately, even to readers who knew nothing about the strait's specific geography or history. The word triangle implied a defined zone, a bounded area with a particular character, and the Bermuda comparison implied that what happened there was somehow beyond ordinary explanation. The geographic boundaries used in popular accounts were never entirely consistent, which is worth noting. Some writers drew the triangle between King Island to the southwest, Flinders Island to the northeast, and a point on the Victorian coast, roughly enclosing the main body of the strait. Others defined it more loosely, sometimes including the waters south of Cape Otway, or extending further into the Tasman Sea. The lack of a fixed boundary was not really a problem for the popular narrative, because the triangle was always more of a concept than a precise geographic designation. It was a way of framing a pattern, or what appeared to be a pattern, rather than a strictly defined maritime zone. Several Australian writers and journalists played a significant role in developing and spreading the label during this period. Rex Gilroy, who wrote extensively about Australian anomalies and unexplained phenomena throughout the 1970s and 1980s, discussed Bass Strait disappearances in the context of broader Australian mysteries. Popular magazine articles in outlets like People and the Australian Women's Weekly occasionally touched on the strait's reputation, framing specific disappearances within the triangle narrative. The framing was not always careful or precise, and some accounts blended well-documented cases with others that were less clearly verified, which is a problem that tends to follow this kind of popular writing wherever it goes. What is important to understand, and what requires a certain amount of care to hold on to when the narrative starts to build momentum, is the difference between two things that often get treated as the same thing. The first is the documented record of disappearances and losses in Bass Strait, which is real, substantial, and spans more than 2 centuries. The second is the interpretive frame of the triangle, which is a cultural construction, a way of organising and presenting that record that emphasises pattern and mystery and implies, without always stating directly, that something unusual is at work. Those two things are not the same, and conflating them is where a lot of the confusion in popular accounts tends to begin. The documented record is not in dispute. Ships have been lost in Bass Strait in large numbers. Aircraft have disappeared over it. Some of those losses are clearly explained by weather, mechanical failure, navigational error, or the strait's well-understood physical hazards. Others have explanations that are incomplete or uncertain. A smaller number have circumstances that remain genuinely puzzling even after investigation. That is the honest picture, and it is a genuinely interesting one without needing any embellishment. The triangle frame, on the other hand, does something specific to that record. It selects certain cases and foregrounds them. It implies a geographical coherence to events that may or may not share a common cause. It borrows the Bermuda Triangle's cultural weight, which itself rests on a foundation that researchers like Lawrence David Kusher had already substantially challenged by 1975, when Kusher published The Bermuda Triangle Mystery Solved, arguing that many of the famous Bermuda cases had been misrepresented, exaggerated, or simply invented. The popular appetite for the triangle concept, in other words, was running ahead of the evidence even in its original form, and transplanting that concept to Bass Strait did not make it more rigorous. None of which means the strait is not genuinely dangerous, or that the unexplained cases are not worth examining carefully. It just means that the label itself should be held a little lightly. It is a frame, not a finding. It tells us something about the cultural moment in which it emerged, and about the human tendency to organise unsettling patterns into named things, as if naming them gives us some small degree of control over what they mean. There is also something worth saying about the way the triangle label affected the perception of the strait's history. Once the frame was in place, older cases that had been understood in straightforwardly historical terms, the Cataraqui, the various 19th century wrecks around King Island, began to be retroactively recruited into the triangle narrative, they became evidence of a pattern that extended back further than the 1970s, which in a sense they did, but not necessarily for the reasons the triangle framing implied. The 19th century losses were explicable in terms of the strait's physical hazards and the navigational limitations of the era. Folding them into a mystery narrative did not make them more mysterious. It just made the mystery seem older and deeper than the evidence strictly supported. That said, and this is the part that requires honest acknowledgement, the cultural label did not emerge from nothing. It emerged from a genuine accumulation of events, some of which were difficult to explain and some of which were actively puzzling to investigators and researchers. The journalists and writers who popularised the triangle framing were not simply inventing a pattern out of clear air. They were responding to a real record of loss, and in some cases to specific events that were, and remain, genuinely hard to account for. The frame was imprecise and borrowed, and culturally loaded, but it was also reaching, however clumsily, towards something that deserved serious attention. The timing of the label's emergence is itself significant. The Bass Strait Triangle framing became most prominent in Australian public discourse in the late 1970s, and that timing overlaps almost exactly with what was, by any measure, an unusual period for unexplained events in the region. The late 1970s in southeastern Australia saw a cluster of UFO reports, a cluster of aviation incidents, and most significantly, the disappearance of a young pilot in circumstances that generated an ATC transcript that is still discussed and debated today. The cultural label and the most compelling case arrived at almost the same moment, which is part of why the two became so entangled in the public imagination. It is worth being precise about what the triangle label does and does not encompass. In its most responsible form, it refers to a geographic zone with a documented higher than average rate of maritime and aviation incidents, some of which have conventional explanations and some of which do not. In its least responsible form, it implies a zone of active paranormal danger where the normal rules of physics and navigation do not apply. Most popular accounts of the Bass Strait Triangle sit somewhere between those two positions, which is part of what makes evaluating them difficult. They are rarely entirely fabricated, but they are rarely entirely rigorous either. What the triangle framing did do, and this is perhaps its most lasting effect, is draw sustained attention to the Strait's record in a way that more sober historical accounts had not. It made Bass Strait a subject of public curiosity in a way that the shipping records and official inquiry documents had not managed to do on their own. And that attention, even when it came packaged in sensationalist terms, did occasionally produce something useful. It prompted people to gather accounts, to interview witnesses, to compile records of disappearances that might otherwise have remained scattered across government files and newspaper archives. The triangle as a cultural object was imprecise and often misleading, but as a prompt for attention, it was effective. The honest picture of the Bass Strait Triangle, then, is something like this. There is a stretch of water with a long and genuine record of loss. That record has real physical explanations for much of it. Explanations rooted in the strait's geography, its weather patterns, its shallow bathymetry, and its position in the path of the Roaring Forties. There is also a subset of cases within that record where the explanations are incomplete, uncertain, or genuinely puzzling. And there is a cultural frame borrowed from a parallel phenomenon in the North Atlantic that organises all of this under a single evocative label and implies a coherence and mystery that the evidence only partially supports. Holding all of that at once is not especially comfortable, because human beings tend to prefer clean answers. Either the triangle is real, meaning something genuinely anomalous is happening there, or it is a media construction, meaning the disappearances are all explicable and the mystery is manufactured. The actual situation is messier than either of those positions. Some things are explained, some are not. The label is a simplification, but the record it points to is real. And somewhere inside that record there are cases that resist easy dismissal, cases where the available explanations feel incomplete in ways that are hard to fully articulate. The most significant of those cases, the one that sits at the centre of any serious discussion of Bass Strait, happened in the early evening of October 21st, 1978. A 20-year-old pilot named Frederick Valentich departed Moorabbin Airport on the southern outskirts of Melbourne, flying a Cessna 182L, heading south across the strait toward King Island. He was flying alone. The weather that evening was clear, the conditions described as good for a straightforward crossing. He had filed a flight plan. He was in radio contact with Melbourne Air Traffic Control. And somewhere over the water something happened that has never been satisfactorily explained, and that left behind a transcript of radio transmissions that remains one of the most discussed documents in Australian aviation history. The Valentich case did not simply become famous because a pilot disappeared over Bass Strait. Pilots had disappeared over Bass Strait before, and their cases, while tragic, had not generated the same sustained attention. What made the Valentich disappearance different, what gave it its particular and lasting grip on public interest, was the content of those radio transmissions. What Valentich described to air traffic control in the minutes before his final transmission was something that did not fit neatly into any of the ordinary categories of aviation incident. And because the transmissions were recorded, because the transcript was official and documented and not a matter of disputed memory, the case occupied a different kind of evidentiary ground than most unexplained disappearances. There was something to look at, something specific and detailed and real, whatever it meant. And what it meant and what it still means is a question that has occupied investigators, researchers, pilots, and ordinary curious people for more than 4 decades. It is a question that sits at the centre of the Bass Strait Triangle's modern identity, the case that gives the cultural label its most compelling specific content. The triangle might have faded from public attention, as many such media constructions eventually do, if the Valentich case had not given it something concrete to anchor to. A name, a date, a transcript, a 20-year-old who took off on a clear evening and was never found. That is where we are heading next, into the specific and documented details of what happened on that October evening, what Valentich said, what the air traffic controller heard, and what the official investigation ultimately concluded, or rather, what it was unable to conclude. Because the Valentich case is not, as some popular accounts would have it, a story with a hidden answer that the authorities are concealing. It is a story with a genuinely open answer, one that has been examined carefully by people with no interest in promoting mystery, and that has remained stubbornly resistant to clean resolution. That resistance is what makes it worth understanding properly. Frederick Valentich was 20 years old. He held a Class 4 instrument rating, which is an important detail, because it tells you something specific about where he was in his flying career. A Class 4 rating allowed him to fly under visual flight rules, meaning he was cleared to fly when he could see where he was going, when the sky was open and the horizon was visible. He was not rated for instrument flight, the kind of flying where you navigate by the dials in front of you when the world outside the cockpit window goes grey or dark or disappears into cloud. He had logged approximately 150 hours of flight time. That is not a negligible amount, but it is not a large amount either. He was a student of aviation, genuinely enthusiastic about it, with plans to pursue a commercial pilot career. He was not an experienced hand. He was someone still in the process of becoming one. The aircraft he was flying that evening was a Cessna 182L Skylane, registration VH-DSJ. It is a single-engine, 4-seat light aircraft, reliable and well-regarded, the kind of plane that has been a workhorse of general aviation for decades. It is not a sophisticated machine by the standards of commercial aviation, but it is a solid one. Valentich had rented it from the flying school at Moorabbin Airport, which sits in the southern suburbs of Melbourne, roughly 10 kilometres from the coast. He departed at approximately 6:19 in the evening local time. The plan was to fly south over Port Phillip Bay, cross the strait and land at King Island, a journey of roughly 235 kilometres. He was, according to his flight plan, picking up a group of friends. Some later accounts questioned whether there were actually any friends waiting for him on King Island, and whether his stated purpose for the flight was accurate. That detail has never been fully resolved. The weather that evening was reported as good. The sky over the strait was clear. Visibility was described as excellent, and the conditions appeared straightforward for the crossing. There was a light aircraft advisory in effect, which is a standard precaution for the area, but nothing that would have grounded a pilot with Valentich's rating on a clear evening. He took off, climbed to around 4,500 feet, and headed south. For the first part of the flight, everything was routine. He checked in with Melbourne Flight Service as expected. The crossing began normally. What happened next is preserved in a transcript that the Australian Department of Transport released after the disappearance. It covers approximately 6.5 minutes of radio communication between Valentich and Melbourne Flight Service, with the controller on duty that evening being Steve Roby. The transcript has been reproduced in countless books and articles, and it is worth going through it carefully, because the details matter, and because the popular summaries of it sometimes compress or rearrange things in ways that subtly change what the record actually shows. At approximately 7:06 in the evening, Valentich contacted Melbourne Flight Service and asked whether there was any known traffic in his area below 5,000 feet. Roby told him there was no known traffic. Valentich then reported that he had a large aircraft below him, which he described as being at about 1,000 feet below his own altitude. He said it had 4 bright landing lights. Roby asked him to confirm whether the aircraft was military or civilian. Valentich said he could not confirm. He said the aircraft was moving at high speed and that it had just passed over him, not under him, above him, at very high speed. He said he could not identify what type of aircraft it was. This is the point where the transcript begins to feel unusual, because Valentich then reported that the craft had disappeared, and then almost immediately reported that it was approaching from the east. He said it was orbiting above him. He described it as having a shiny metal surface with a green light on it. He said it was long, and that he could not identify it. Roby, for his part, was calm and professional throughout, asking clarifying questions, trying to gather information. At one point, he asked Valentich to confirm that he could not identify the aircraft. Valentich confirmed that he could not. Then there was a gap in the transmission, and Valentich came back on the radio sounding noticeably less composed. He said his engine was running rough. He said he was experiencing engine problems, though he did not specify the nature of them. He said the aircraft was not climbing as it should be. He gave his position as being over Cape Otway, which is the southernmost point of the Victorian mainland, a lighthouse headland that marks the entrance to the strait. He said he was proceeding to King Island, and then he made his final transmission, which is the one that has been quoted and discussed more than any other. He said, and these are the words from the official transcript, that strange aircraft is hovering on top of me again. It is hovering, and it is not an aircraft. And then there was a metallic scraping sound, described by investigators as lasting approximately 17 seconds, and then silence. Melbourne Flight Service attempted to contact Valentich repeatedly after that. There was no response. The RAAF was notified. A search was initiated. Aircraft and vessels were deployed across the strait. The search covered a large area and continued for several days. No wreckage was found. No body was found. No debris consistent with a Cessna 182L was recovered from the water. The aircraft, and the man flying it, had simply ceased to be findable. The official investigation was conducted by what was then the Australian Department of Transport, the predecessor to the body now known as the ATSB, the Australian Transport Safety Bureau. The investigation examined the weather, the aircraft's maintenance records, Valentich's training and flight history, and the content of the radio transmissions. It concluded, after a thorough examination, that the cause of the disappearance could not be determined. That is the official finding, not pilot error, not mechanical failure, not any specific cause. Unknown. The file was formally closed in 1983, though interest in the case has never really closed at all. Now, there are several explanations that have been seriously proposed for what happened to Frederick Valentich, and each of them deserves a fair look, because none of them is obviously correct and none of them is entirely satisfying. The first, and in many ways the most technically grounded, is spatial disorientation. This is a condition that affects pilots, particularly those flying at night or over featureless terrain like open water, where the absence of a visible horizon can cause the inner ear to send false signals to the brain. A pilot experiencing spatial disorientation may believe they are flying straight and level when they are actually in a descent, or may believe they are turning when they are not. It is a genuine and well-documented hazard in aviation, and it has been the cause of numerous fatal accidents. The spatial disorientation theory for the Valentich case suggests that he became disoriented over the dark water of the strait, that his perception of his own aircraft's attitude and the objects around him became unreliable, and that what he described to air traffic control was a misinterpretation of his own aircraft's reflection, or lights, or some other optical phenomenon produced by his confused spatial perception. This theory has genuine merit in some respects. Valentich was flying at night over water, which is exactly the kind of environment where spatial disorientation is most likely to occur. He was not rated for instrument flight, which means he may have had less training in recognizing and correcting for disorientation, and some of what he described, an aircraft that kept appearing and disappearing, that seemed to orbit him, that moved at high speed, could potentially be explained by the kind of perceptual confusion that disorientation produces. But the spatial disorientation theory has a problem, and it is the metallic scraping sound. That sound was heard by Steve Robey at Melbourne Flight Service. It was recorded. It lasted approximately 17 seconds. Spatial disorientation does not produce metallic scraping sounds that are transmitted over radio. Whatever that sound was, it was something physical, something happening to or near the aircraft, and it does not fit neatly into the disorientation explanation. Proponents of the theory sometimes suggest the sound was the aircraft entering an uncontrolled descent and breaking apart, or the engine failing catastrophically, but the timing and character of the sound coming after Valentich's final words rather than before them makes that interpretation difficult to sustain cleanly. The second explanation that has been seriously proposed is a staged disappearance. The idea here is that Valentich deliberately arranged to vanish, that there was no accident, that he landed somewhere, abandoned the aircraft and assumed a new identity. People who find this explanation plausible point to the uncertainty about whether there were actually any friends waiting for him on King Island, to some accounts suggesting he had personal or financial difficulties at the time, and to the fact that no wreckage was ever found, which could, in theory, mean the aircraft was never in the water to begin with. This explanation is not impossible, but it requires accepting several things that are difficult to account for. It requires that Valentich had arranged an alternative landing location without anyone knowing about it, that he had the means and the plan to disappear completely, and that he successfully maintained that disappearance for the rest of his life without any credible sighting or contact. It also requires explaining why he would have fabricated the elaborate description of an unknown craft over the radio, a description that would draw enormous attention to his disappearance, rather than allowing it to go unnoticed. If you wanted to stage a disappearance quietly, broadcasting a detailed account of a mysterious aircraft to air traffic control seemed like a poor strategy. The staged disappearance theory has its advocates, but the more carefully you examine it, the more it seems to require accepting a level of premeditation and capability that does not fit well with what is known about Valentich's circumstances. The third explanation is the one that gets the most popular attention and the least serious scientific support, which is that Valentich encountered a genuine unidentified craft of non-human origin, and that his disappearance was connected to that encounter in some direct way. This explanation is, obviously, the one that the UFO community has embraced most enthusiastically, and it was given additional cultural weight by the fact that 1978 was a year of significant UFO activity in Australia. There were multiple reported sightings across the country in the months surrounding the Valentich disappearance, including some in the Bass Strait region itself. The New Zealand film crew that captured footage of unusual lights over the strait in December of that same year, footage that was later examined by scientists and never definitively explained, added to the sense that something strange was happening in the region during that period. The UFO explanation cannot be dismissed on the grounds that it is inherently impossible, because intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that we do not have a complete inventory of everything that exists, but it also cannot be accepted on the grounds that it fits the emotional shape of the story, which is essentially what most popular accounts do when they invoke it. The physical evidence for the UFO explanation is, to be direct about it, very thin. The transcript is real, but the transcript records what Valentich said he saw, not what was actually there. And what a person says they see, particularly a person who may be experiencing disorientation or stress, is not the same as a verified observation. The metallic scraping sound remains genuinely puzzling regardless of which explanation you favour, but a puzzling sound is not, by itself, evidence of extraterrestrial involvement. What the ATSB investigation actually concluded, stripped of the popular framing that has accumulated around it, is that there was insufficient evidence to determine what happened. That is a different thing from concluding that something paranormal occurred. It means the investigators looked at everything available to them and could not construct a complete account of the event. That is an honest finding. It is also an unsatisfying one, which is part of why the case has continued to attract attention and speculation for more than 4 decades. There is one additional detail about the Valentich case that tends to get less attention than the transcript, but that is worth noting. In 1983, a piece of aircraft engine cowling was found on Flinders Island at the northern end of Bass Strait. It was examined and found to be consistent with a Cessna 182, though it could not be definitively confirmed as coming from VH-DSJ specifically. Some researchers have pointed to this as evidence that the aircraft did go into the water and break up, which would support either the spatial disorientation or the mechanical failure explanation. Others have noted that the piece was found 5 years after the disappearance, and that its provenance could not be fully established. It is a detail that adds something to the picture without completing it. Frederick Valentich was 20 years old. He was enthusiastic about flying. He had a plan for his career, and a flight plan filed for a clear evening crossing, and he spoke to air traffic control for 6.5 minutes about something he could not identify, and then he was gone. The transcript is real. The search was real. The absence of any wreckage, any body, any definitive answer is real. And the case sits in the centre of the Bass Strait Triangle's modern identity, not because it is the most dramatic disappearance in the Strait's history, but because it is the most documented, the most specific, and the most resistant to clean resolution. It is not the only case of its kind, though. Valentich's disappearance tends to dominate the conversation about Bass Strait in a way that can make the Strait's broader record feel like a backdrop to a single story. But the Strait has been taking things for much longer than 1978, and not only aircraft. The water has its own appetite for ships, and the record of vessel losses in the Strait is in some ways even more extensive than the aviation record because it goes back further, and because the sea has had more time to practice. One of the cases that illustrates this most clearly happened 5 years before Valentich disappeared, in 1973, when a small cargo vessel called the Blythe Star left Hobart with a crew of 10 and headed out into the Strait, and the Strait in its particular way made the straightforward crossing into something else entirely. The Blythe Star left Hobart on the 22nd of October, 1973. She was a small cargo vessel, around 56 metres in length, carrying a crew of 10 men and a load of general cargo bound for ports along the Tasmanian coast and beyond. The crossing she was making was not unusual. It was the kind of run that small cargo ships made regularly across Bass Strait, the kind of voyage that experienced mariners did not necessarily think of as particularly hazardous, provided the weather held. The weather, as it so often does in the Strait, did not hold. The details of exactly what happened to the Blythe Star in those first hours are not fully known. because the vessel sent no distress signal. She simply stopped appearing where she was expected to appear. When she failed to arrive at her scheduled port, a search was initiated and the search found nothing. No wreckage, no debris field, no oil slick. Just the strait, grey and cold and unhelpful, as it tends to be when people start asking it questions. What makes the Blythe Star case different from a simple disappearance is what came next. 66 days after the vessel went missing, a life raft was spotted in the waters of Bass Strait. On board were 2 survivors, the ship's cook and 1 other crew member, both in extremely poor condition after more than 2 months adrift in one of the coldest and most unpredictable stretches of water in the southern hemisphere. They had survived on rainwater and whatever they could catch. They had watched other crew members die, and they had drifted for 66 days through the same water that had swallowed their ship. Their account of what happened was fragmentary, as you would expect from men who had been through that experience, but it described a vessel that had encountered severe weather conditions and flooding, and that had gone down rapidly. The speed of the sinking was consistent with the absence of a distress signal. If a ship goes down fast enough, there simply is not time to send one. The survivors described the sea state as extreme, the kind of conditions that the strait can generate with very little warning when the roaring 40s push a swell into shallow water and the wave faces steepen and break. It is not a dramatic explanation. It is in some ways a very ordinary one. A ship in bad weather in shallow water. But 66 days on a life raft in Bass Strait is not ordinary, and 8 men died, and the ship itself was never found. The Blythe Star case is instructive not because it is mysterious in the same way that the Valentish disappearance is mysterious, but because it illustrates something important about how the strait works. It does not always announce what it is doing. Ships can go down without signals, without debris fields that persist, without leaving the kind of clear evidence that allows investigators to reconstruct what happened. The water is cold enough to accelerate the deterioration of materials, the currents are strong enough to disperse wreckage over wide areas, and the shallow, irregular bottom can bury things or move them in ways that make systematic searching very difficult. The strait is not hiding things exactly. It is just not cooperating with the human need for answers. The vessel losses in Bass Strait go back much further than 1973, of course. The maritime record of the strait is long, and in certain stretches grim. The Eliza Ramsden disappeared in 1875 with all hands, a small trading vessel that simply failed to arrive. The Casino, a passenger ferry, was wrecked in 1932 near the entrance to the Glenelg River after misjudging her position in poor visibility, killing 35 people. These are not cases that attract much attention today, partly because they predate the media environment that gave the Bass Strait Triangle its name, and partly because they fit recognisable patterns of maritime disaster. Navigation error, bad weather, mechanical failure. The explanations are available even if the exact sequence of events is not always recoverable. But the accumulation of those cases across more than 2 centuries of maritime use tells a story about the strait that does not require any unusual explanation. The strait is simply, statistically and physically, one of the more dangerous stretches of water that ships regularly cross. The combination of shallow depth, extreme weather exposure, hidden reefs, and the volume of traffic that has passed through it since the colonial period has produced a record of loss that would be remarkable almost anywhere in the world. When you add the aviation losses on top of the maritime record, the picture becomes even more striking. Now, there is something worth pausing on here, which is the question of whether the triangle framing actually helps us understand any of this, or whether it does something more complicated. When journalists and popular writers began grouping these cases together, under the Bass Strait Triangle label in the 1970s and 1980s, they were drawing on a cultural template that the Bermuda Triangle had already established. The template works like this. You identify a geographic area, you collect disappearances that occurred within it, you present them as a pattern, and you imply that the pattern requires an explanation beyond ordinary causes. The template is effective as a narrative device because it creates the impression of significance through accumulation. Each individual case might have a mundane explanation, but the clustering of cases in one area feels like it must mean something. The problem with this approach, applied to Bass Strait, is that it tends to flatten the differences between cases that are actually quite different from one another. A cargo ship sinking in a storm is not the same kind of event as a light aircraft disappearing on a clear evening with no wreckage found. A navigation error that puts a vessel on a reef is not the same as a pilot describing an unknown craft over the radio. Grouping them together under a single label can make the strait seem uniformly mysterious, when in fact its record is a mixture of the explained, the partially explained, and the genuinely unresolved. The triangle label does not lie, exactly, but it does select. It emphasises the cases that resist explanation, and quietly de-emphasises the ones that do not, which gives the overall picture a dramatic tilt that the raw record does not quite support. That said, dismissing the pattern entirely because of how it has been packaged is also not quite right. There are cases in the Bass Strait record that are genuinely difficult to account for. The Valentich disappearance is the most prominent, but it is not the only one. And the physical character of the strait does create conditions that are unusual enough to produce outcomes that would not occur in most other stretches of water. The combination of factors at work in the strait is not replicated in many places. The shallow depth amplifying wave behaviour, the roaring 40s funneling through the gap, the magnetic anomalies associated with the underlying geology, the rapid weather changes caused by the collision of different air masses, the distance from shore that is long enough to be genuinely dangerous for light aircraft, but short enough that pilots sometimes do not prepare for it, as carefully as they would a longer crossing. These are real factors, documented and measurable. They do not require anything paranormal to explain most of what the strait does. But they do create an environment where things can go wrong, in ways that are harder to predict and harder to reconstruct after the fact than in more straightforward open water environments. The spatial disorientation issue is worth returning to here because it is relevant not just to the Valentich case, but to the broader aviation record of the strait. Spatial disorientation occurs when a pilot's vestibular system gives them false information about the aircraft's attitude, typically in conditions of low visibility or at night, when visual reference to the horizon is unavailable. A pilot experiencing spatial disorientation may be certain they are flying level when they are actually in a descending turn. They may feel they are climbing when they are descending. The condition is well documented and is responsible for a significant proportion of general aviation accidents worldwide. It is particularly dangerous over water, where the visual cues that a pilot might use to orient themselves on land are absent, and where the surface of the water can be difficult to distinguish from the sky in certain lighting conditions. The evening of October 21st, 1978, when Valentich made his crossing, was described as having good visibility overall, but the conditions over the strait as he flew south would have included the darkening water below and the fading light above. Whether those conditions were sufficient to induce disorientation is something the investigators could not determine with certainty. What they could say is that the conditions were not so clearly favourable as to make disorientation impossible, and spatial disorientation in a light aircraft can progress very quickly from an early sense of something being wrong to a loss of control that the pilot may not be able to recover from, particularly if they are simultaneously trying to communicate with air traffic control and interpret what they are seeing above them. The metallic scraping sound at the end of the transmission is the detail that does not sit comfortably in the disorientation explanation, and it is worth being direct about that. If Valentich had experienced disorientation and lost control of the aircraft, you would expect the transmission to end with a loss of signal consistent with the aircraft going into the water, not with a prolonged scraping sound. Some researchers have suggested the sound could have been produced by the aircraft itself if it was in an unusual attitude, or by interference on the radio frequency, or even by Valentich inadvertently activating something in the cockpit. None of these suggestions have been confirmed. They are possibilities offered to fill a gap, and they have the slightly strained quality that explanations sometimes develop when they are being stretched to cover something they do not quite fit. The honest position is that the metallic scraping sound is unexplained. Not unexplained in the sense of requiring a dramatic alternative theory, but unexplained in the more literal sense that no one has been able to say with confidence what produced it. It is a 6-second audio recording that has been analysed multiple times and has not yielded a definitive answer. That is a small but real piece of the Valentich case that sits outside any of the available explanations, and acknowledging it does not commit you to any particular interpretation. It just means the picture is not complete. What the ATSB investigation produced in the end was a finding of cause unknown. The formal language of aviation investigations is precise in ways that matter here. Because unknown does not mean cause paranormal. It does not mean cause extraterrestrial. It means that the investigators examined the available evidence, which included the ATC transcript, the weather records, the flight plan, Valentich's training records and medical history, the search results, and the later discovery of the engine cowling fragment on Flinders Island, and they could not construct a complete causal account of the accident. The investigation is formally closed, but the file has never been resolved in the sense of producing an agreed understanding of what happened. The engine cowling fragment is worth a moment of attention here. It was found in 1983, 5 years after the disappearance on the western coast of Flinders Island. Flinders Island sits at the northeastern end of Bass Strait, and the discovery of aircraft debris there is consistent with a scenario in which the Cessna went into the water somewhere in the strait and the debris was carried by currents to the island's shore over a period of years. The fragment was examined and found to be consistent with the Cessna 182, the type Valentich was flying, though the examination could not confirm it came from Veach-DSJ specifically. The significance of the fragment depends somewhat on which explanation you favour. If you accept the spatial disorientation or mechanical failure theory, the fragment is a small piece of physical evidence supporting the idea that the aircraft went into the water. If you favour the stage disappearance theory, the fragment is either coincidental or planted, neither of which is easily demonstrated. If you favour the UFO explanation, the fragment is either irrelevant or evidence that the aircraft was released or destroyed after whatever encounter occurred. The fragment is real. What it means is, like most things in the Valentich case, open to interpretation. Frederick Valentich has been gone for more than 45 years now. The transcript of his final transmission has been read and analysed and argued over for all of that time. It has been the subject of books, documentaries, academic papers, and an enormous volume of online discussion. It remains, in the specific sense of being a documented event with no agreed explanation, one of the more genuinely puzzling cases in the history of aviation. Not because it is certainly paranormal, but because it is certainly unresolved, and because the details of it are specific enough that the standard explanations require some degree of accommodation to fit. That combination, specific details, documented evidence, no clean resolution, is what keeps the case alive in the way that vague stories do not stay alive. But Valentich's disappearance, as central as it is to the modern identity of the Bass Strait Triangle, is in some ways the most unusual case in the Strait's record rather than the most representative one. Most of what the Strait has been taken in ways that are less ambiguous, if not always fully explained. Ships in storms, vessels on reefs, aircraft in deteriorating weather. The Strait does not need anything unusual to be dangerous. Its physical character is sufficient for that. An understanding that physical character, the mechanics of what makes this particular stretch of water so consistently hazardous, is where the story needs to go next. So the Strait takes aircraft. That much is established. But it would be a mistake to think of Bass Strait as a danger that belongs only to the sky. The water itself has been collecting things for as long as people have been crossing it, and the record of vessels lost in this stretch of ocean is long enough and specific enough that the Valentich case, for all its peculiarity, sits within a much older and broader pattern of disappearance. In September of 1973, a small coastal freighter called the MV Blythe Star left Hobart bound for King Island, carrying a cargo that included fuel drums and general supplies. She had a crew of 10 men. The crossing was not considered unusual. The Blythe Star was a working vessel on a working route, the kind of trip that happens dozens of times a year without incident. She never arrived at King Island. There was no distress signal. No mayday call was received by any station. The vessel simply ceased to be in contact, and when she did not arrive, a search was initiated across the strait. The search found nothing for a long time. Days passed. The search area expanded. Aircraft flew grids across the water and found no wreckage, no oil slick, no debris field. Then, 66 days after the Blythe Star departed Hobart, a life raft was spotted. On it were 3 survivors, emaciated and badly dehydrated but alive, having drifted for more than 2 months on open water. Their names were John Gray, James Ramage, and Raymond Harris. They had survived on rainwater and what little food they had been able to salvage before the vessel went down. What their account described was a rapid and catastrophic sinking. The Blythe Star had encountered severe weather in the strait. The seas had been extreme, and the vessel, which was not a large ship, had been overwhelmed. The survivors described the situation deteriorating very quickly, faster than they had expected, and the vessel going under before a proper distress signal could be sent or a full evacuation completed. 7 of the 10 crew did not survive. The 3 men on the life raft had managed to get clear, but the others had not. It was a disaster that unfolded in the space of minutes rather than hours, which is part of why there was no warning received by anyone on shore. The Blythe Star case is instructive for a few reasons. One is that it demonstrates how quickly Bass Strait can change the outcome of a crossing that seemed manageable at departure. Another is that the absence of a distress signal, which might seem suspicious or unexplained in isolation, had a straightforward explanation once the survivors could give their account. The vessel went down so fast that there was no time. This is worth keeping in mind when thinking about other disappearances in the strait, where no signal was received, because the absence of a mayday is not necessarily evidence of something unusual. It can simply mean the end came faster than anyone could respond to it. The survivors were found 66 days after the sinking, which is itself a remarkable story of endurance. The life raft had drifted a considerable distance, carried by the currents that move through the strait in patterns that are consistent but not always predictable. The fact that they were found at all, after that length of time, was partly luck, and partly the persistence of the search effort, which had never been fully abandoned. The Blythe Star case is remembered now primarily as a survival story, but it is also a disappearance story because for those first weeks the vessel and its crew were simply gone, and the strait had given no indication of what had happened to them. The Blythe Star is not the only vessel that fits this description, not by a long measure. The record of ship losses in Bass Strait goes back to the earliest colonial period, and while many of those losses can be attributed to the well-documented hazards of the strait, the sheer accumulation of them over time creates a picture that is worth sitting with for a moment. The Eliza Ramsden is one of the older cases. She was a sailing vessel that disappeared in 1875 somewhere in the strait with all hands. No wreckage was found at the time, and the cause of her loss was never established. The conditions in the strait during that period of the year were not recorded as being exceptionally severe, which made the disappearance slightly harder to account for in the straightforward way that storm losses usually can be. She was a reasonably sound vessel on a known route, and she vanished. That is essentially the complete record of what happened to her. The Casino is a later case and a different kind of loss. She was a passenger and cargo steamer that sank in 1932 after striking a reef near the Tasmanian coast, not far from the western entrance to the strait. 52 people died. The Casino had been operating in reduced visibility, and the reef she struck was known to navigators, though not always well marked on the charts of the period. It is a case that sits more clearly in the category of navigational error combined with poor conditions, but it is part of the same statistical record of the Strait's toll on vessels attempting to cross or navigate its waters. What these cases share across different eras and different types of vessels is a combination of factors that the Strait reliably produces. Sudden weather deterioration, shallow water that amplifies wave behaviour in ways that surprise even experienced mariners, reefs and banks that are not always where the charts suggest, or that are marked but difficult to identify in poor visibility, and a geography that means there is often no shelter available when conditions turn. You cannot simply anchor in Bass Strait and wait out a storm the way you might in a more protected body of water. The options are to continue, to turn back, or to be overwhelmed by what the Strait sends at you. The shallow bathymetry of the Strait is central to understanding why it behaves the way it does, and it is worth being specific about this rather than speaking about it in vague terms. The Bass Strait sits on the continental shelf between mainland Australia and Tasmania. The average depth across much of the Strait is between 50 and 70 metres, which sounds like a reasonable depth until you consider the scale of the swells that enter from the Southern Ocean. When a large swell generated by the roaring forties, those persistent westerly winds that circle the southern hemisphere between roughly 40 and 60 degrees south latitude, when that swell moves from the deep water of the Southern Ocean into the shallow water of Bass Strait, the physics of what happens to it changes significantly. In deep water, waves move relatively freely, with long periods between crests and a shape that, while large, is not necessarily steep or breaking. When those same waves reach shallow water, the bottom begins to interact with the wave motion. The wave slows down at the base while the surface continues moving, which causes the wave to steepen. In water as shallow as Bass Strait, this effect is pronounced. Waves that were manageable in deep water become steeper, shorter in period, and more likely to break at the crest. Breaking waves are far more dangerous to vessels than non-breaking waves of similar height, because the energy in a breaking crest is applied suddenly and directly, rather than being distributed across the hull as a vessel rises and falls on a swell. The effect is something like the difference between being pushed and being hit. Experienced mariners who have crossed Bass Strait in heavy weather often describe the sea state as unlike anything they encounter in the open ocean, specifically because of this steepening effect in shallow water. The roaring forties compound this significantly. The Strait sits directly in the path of these winds, which have been building across thousands of kilometres of open ocean before they reach the gap between Victoria and Tasmania. There is no significant landmass between the western entrance to Bass Strait and the coast of South Africa to interrupt them. They arrive carrying a fetch, which is the technical term for the uninterrupted distance over which wind has been acting on the water surface, that is long enough to generate substantial swells even in relatively moderate wind conditions. When the wind is not moderate, which in the roaring forties is frequently the case, the swells that enter the Strait can be very large indeed, and the shallow water transforms them into something that vessels have been struggling with for as long as vessels have been crossing here. There is also the question of how quickly conditions can change in this region. The Bass Strait sits at a meteorological boundary where cold, dry air from the Southern Ocean meets warmer, more humid air from the Australian continent. The collision of these air masses can produce low-pressure systems that develop rapidly and intensify faster than weather forecasting. Even modern forecasting can always anticipate. In the era before satellite weather observation, this was a serious problem for mariners and aviators alike. A crossing that began in reasonable conditions could deteriorate within a few hours to the point where the vessel or aircraft was in genuine danger, with no practical way to have predicted the change at the time of departure. Even today, Bass Strait weather is considered among the more challenging forecasting environments in the Southern Hemisphere, and experienced mariners treat the crossing with a degree of caution that the Strait's relatively modest width might not immediately suggest. The fog is another element that does not always receive the attention it deserves in accounts of Bass Strait. The The same collision of air masses that produces rapid weather development also produces fog, sometimes thick and persistent, particularly in the warmer months when the temperature differential between the Southern Ocean air and the Strait's surface water is most pronounced. Fog in Bass Strait can reduce visibility to near zero with relatively little warning, and the combination of fog, strong currents, and the proximity of reefs and islands makes navigation in those conditions extremely demanding. Several of the historical wrecks around King Island and the Furneaux Group occurred in conditions where fog was a contributing factor, limiting the crew's ability to identify their position or the hazards ahead of them before it was too late. The currents around King Island and the Furneaux Group, the chain of islands at the eastern end of the strait, are also worth understanding as specific physical features rather than vague background hazards. The currents in the strait are driven by a combination of tidal forces and the prevailing westerly winds, and they can run at several knots in certain areas, particularly around the islands where the water is forced through narrower passages. For a vessel that has lost power, or a life raft, or an aircraft wreckage field, these currents mean that the location of impact and the location of debris can be very different from each other. The Blythe Star survivors drifted 66 days on currents that carried them a considerable distance from where the vessel went down. This is not unusual in Bass Strait. It is part of why searches in the strait are so difficult, and why the absence of wreckage in a given area does not necessarily mean the loss did not occur in that area. All of this, the shallow water, the roaring 40s swells, the rapid weather development, the fog, the currents, and the reefs, adds up to a set of conditions that are genuinely unusual compared to many other bodies of water of similar size. The strait is not a particularly large body of water. It is not a deep ocean trench or a remote polar sea. It is a relatively short crossing between two parts of a modern, developed country with functioning search and rescue infrastructure, and yet it has been taking vessels and aircraft with a consistency and a frequency that has attracted attention for a very long time, and that attention is not entirely without justification. The physical explanations account for a great deal, probably for most of what the strait has taken, when you examine the cases individually and with care. But accounting for most is not the same as accounting for all, and the strait's record contains enough cases where the physical explanation is either incomplete or simply unavailable, that the question of what else might be contributing to its character remains an open one. The Valentich disappearance sits in that category. So do several of the vessel losses where conditions at the time were not clearly severe enough to explain the outcome. What makes Bass Strait interesting, and what keeps its reputation alive beyond simple maritime statistics, is that the physical and the unexplained sight alongside each other in its record, and separating them cleanly is not always possible. Understanding the physical mechanisms is essential to that process, and it is where any serious account of the strait has to begin. But having established what the water and the weather can do on their own, it becomes possible to look more carefully at what the strait's specific geography means for the aircraft that cross it, and why the combination of factors that make it dangerous for ships creates a different but equally serious set of problems for pilots flying above it. The shallow bathymetry of Bass Strait is worth spending a little more time with, because it is one of those details that sounds technical but actually explains a great deal once you understand what it means in practice. The average depth of the strait, somewhere between 50 and 70 metres across most of its width, places it firmly on the continental shelf. The Bassian Plain, which forms the broad, relatively flat floor of the strait, was dry land during the last ice age, when sea levels were low enough that Tasmania was connected to mainland Australia by a land bridge. Animals walked across it. People may have walked across it. What is now open water was once a landscape of rivers and plains, and the sea floor still carries the contours of that former land surface, with channels that were once river valleys and rises that were once low hills. This is not just geological trivia. The irregular topography of the strait's floor, combined with its overall shallowness, affects how currents move through it, how sediment is distributed, and how waves behave as they cross it. When a wave generated in deep water enters shallow water, it changes character. The physics of this transformation are reasonably well understood. As the water depth decreases, the wave's energy, which in deep water is distributed through a considerable vertical column of water, gets compressed into a smaller space. The wave slows slightly, its wavelength shortens, and its height increases. In very shallow water, waves can become steep-faced and unstable, breaking unpredictably rather than rolling through in the long regular swells characteristic of deep ocean. Bass Strait sits in an intermediate zone where this transformation is actively occurring across much of its width, and the result is a sea state that experienced mariners describe as confused or chaotic, meaning that waves are arriving from multiple directions with varying heights and periods, rather than the more predictable pattern of open ocean swells. The roaring 40s contribute to this in a specific way. The term refers to the latitudinal band between roughly 40 and 50 degrees south, where the absence of significant landmass allows the westerly winds to blow with very little interruption around the entire southern hemisphere. Bass Strait sits at approximately 39 to 42 degrees south, placing it right at the northern edge of this wind belt. The winds that enter the strait from the west have typically been blowing over the Southern Ocean for thousands of kilometres before they arrive, and they carry that history with them. The swells they generate in deep water can have very long periods, meaning the time between successive wave crests can be 15 or 20 seconds, and these long-period swells carry a great deal of energy. When they enter the shallow water of the strait, that energy has to go somewhere, and it goes upward. The wave height increases, the period shortens, and the character of the sea changes from the long rolling swells of the open ocean to something shorter, steeper, and considerably more violent. This is why Bass Strait in a gale does not simply look like a rough version of normal ocean. It looks different. The waves are steeper relative to their height. They break more readily, and the breaking crests carry a force that is disproportionate to what a mariner accustomed to deep water sailing might expect from a sea of that apparent size. Several accounts from survivors of Bass Strait crossings in bad weather describe being surprised by the violence of the conditions relative to the wind speed, which is a direct consequence of this shallow water wave amplification effect. The Bassian Plains' irregular floor also creates localized areas where wave energy is focused or reflected in ways that produce particularly rough patches of water, even when the overall conditions are not extreme. There are areas of the strait where two wave trains from different directions intersect, producing what are called cross seas, where the waves arrive at angles to each other and create a grid-like pattern of peaks and troughs that is especially difficult for vessels to handle. A vessel in a cross sea is being pushed and rolled in multiple directions simultaneously, which puts enormous stress on the hull and rigging and makes it very difficult for the crew to maintain control. These conditions can develop in the strait even when the wind is not particularly strong, simply because the shallow floor and the complex interaction of swell directions create a sea state that does not require exceptional weather to be genuinely dangerous. King Island and the Furneaux Group, the two island clusters that define the western and eastern ends of the strait respectively, each create their own specific hazard zones that are worth understanding individually. King Island, positioned directly in the path of the westerly swells, forces the water to divide and accelerate around its flanks. The currents that result from this can run at 3 or 4 knots in places, which is fast enough to significantly affect the track of any vessel that does not account for them carefully. The reefs that extend from King Island's coastline are partially submerged, which means they are not always visible at the surface, particularly in the kind of rough, foaming conditions that often accompany the strong westerlies. The Cape Wickham reef system on the island's northern end and the Navarine Reef further out to sea have both claimed vessels whose navigators either did not know the reefs were there or misjudged their position relative to them. The combination of strong currents pushing vessels off their intended track and the presence of reefs that are difficult to see in bad weather is a particularly dangerous one, and the waters around King Island carry the evidence of this in the form of more than 60 documented wrecks. The Furneaux Group at the eastern end of the strait creates a different kind of hazard. The islands in this group, of which Flinders Island is the largest, are scattered across a wide area with numerous channels and passages between them. The tidal currents through these channels can be strong and variable, and the navigation requires careful attention to both the chart and the state of the tide. Historically, vessels approaching the eastern end of the strait from the west had the additional problem of determining their precise longitude, which before the era of accurate chronometers was genuinely difficult at sea. A vessel that thought it was clear of the Furneaux group by a comfortable margin might in fact be on a collision course with one of the smaller islands or the reef surrounding them, and the strong currents in the region would not necessarily help them recognise the error in time. Several of the 19th century wrecks in the Eastern Strait occurred in circumstances consistent with this kind of navigational uncertainty, compounded by currents set. The fog deserves its own consideration as a physical mechanism, because it operates differently from the storm conditions that tend to dominate accounts of Bass Strait's dangers. The Strait's fog is not simply a nuisance that reduces visibility. In certain conditions, it can be dense enough to bring visibility down to a few tens of meters, and it can develop quickly enough to catch a vessel or aircraft in open water with very little warning. The mechanism is the collision of air masses at different temperatures and humidity levels, which is a persistent feature of the Strait's meteorology given its position between the cold Southern Ocean and the warmer Australian continent. In summer, when the sea surface retains some warmth from the previous months, cold air moving northward from the Southern Ocean can produce advection fog over the strait, where the cold air is cooled further by contact with the slightly warmer water and moisture condenses. In winter, the pattern can reverse. The result is that fog is a year-round possibility in the strait, and the historical record of wrecks includes a number of cases where fog was identified as a contributing factor, limiting the crew's ability to identify landmarks, locate hazards, or determine their position before it was too late. There is also the question of what happens to the air above the strait in terms of atmospheric stability. The rapid weather development that characterises the region is not simply a matter of storms arriving from the west, though that is certainly part of it. The strait can generate its own local weather systems under certain conditions, where the interaction of the sea surface, the prevailing winds, and the surrounding land masses creates localised low-pressure development that intensifies faster than the regional forecast would suggest. Pilots crossing the strait in light aircraft have reported encountering conditions that deteriorated significantly and rapidly in ways that the weather briefing they received before departure did not indicate. This is not necessarily a failure of the forecasting system, though that can be a factor. It is sometimes simply a consequence of the strait's ability to produce localised weather that is not well captured by the regional models. The area covered by Bass Strait is small enough that the spatial resolution of weather forecasting systems, even modern ones, can miss features that develop within the strait itself. The temperature of the water is a factor that tends to be overlooked in popular accounts, but it matters in the context of survival. The Bass Strait's water temperature ranges from roughly 10 to 18 degrees Celsius, depending on the season and the specific location, which places it firmly in the range where cold water incapacitation becomes a serious concern for anyone who ends up in the water after a vessel or aircraft loss. At 10 degrees, the time before a person loses the ability to swim effectively can be measured in minutes. Even at 15 degrees, survival time without a dry suit or immersion suit is limited to a few hours at most, and the ability to perform useful actions like deploying a life raft or signalling for help degrades rapidly as the cold affects muscle control and cognitive function. This is relevant to understanding why some Bass Strait losses produced no survivors even when the vessel or aircraft did not simply vanish without trace, and why the search window for survivors after a loss in the strait is relatively narrow. What all of this adds up to is a picture of a body of water that is genuinely physically unusual in the specific combination of hazards it presents. The shallowness that amplifies waves, the roaring 40s swells arriving with deep ocean energy and transforming in shallow water, the irregular sea floor creating cross seas and confused conditions, the the strong and variable currents around the islands, the fog, the rapid weather development, the cold water, the reefs that are difficult to see in rough conditions, and the navigational challenges of the eastern and western ends of the strait all combine in a way that makes Bass Strait considerably more dangerous than its width or its average depth would suggest to someone who had not crossed it. It is not the size of the place that makes it formidable. It is the specific combination of physical features that interact with each other in ways that compound the risk at every level. This is the honest foundation of the strait's reputation. Not mystery, not paranormal activity, not any force that science cannot account for, but a set of real physical mechanisms that have been documented, studied, and to a considerable degree understood. The roaring 40s are real. The shallow water wave amplification is real. The fog is real. The currents are real. The reefs are real. And the losses that can be explained by these factors are, when you look at the historical record carefully, the majority of what the strait has taken. That is an important thing to establish clearly because it is the honest starting point for any serious examination of the strait's record, and it provides the framework against which the cases that cannot be fully explained by these factors stand out more clearly. But the physical science of Bass Strait, as thorough as it is, describes the water and the weather. It describes the environment below and around the aircraft that cross the strait. What it does not fully account for is the specific situation of a pilot in a light aircraft, flying above all of that water, facing a different set of risks that intersect with the physical dangers of the strait in ways that are not always obvious from the maritime picture alone. The crossing that a vessel makes over days or hours, the crossing that a ferry makes overnight with navigation equipment and a professional crew, is a different kind of challenge from the crossing that a private pilot makes in a single-engine aircraft. Looking down at the grey water, watching the weather on the horizon, and calculating whether the fuel and the visibility and the conditions are going to hold long enough to reach the other side. And it is in that specific situation, the light aircraft crossing, that some of the strait's most documented and most puzzling losses have occurred. The light aircraft crossing of Bass Strait is, in some ways, a deceptively simple proposition on paper. You are looking at roughly 240 kilometres of open water, which in a Cessna or a Piper Cherokee at cruising speed translates to somewhere between 1.5 and 2 hours of flight time depending on the wind. For a pilot based in Victoria, that is not an enormous distance. You can drive further than that in a single afternoon on a highway. And that, according to aviation safety investigators and researchers who have looked at the strait's accident record, is part of the problem. The crossing is long enough to be genuinely dangerous for a light aircraft, but it does not feel long enough to demand the kind of careful, conservative planning that a longer overwater flight would naturally prompt. There is a psychological threshold somewhere around 3 or 4 hours of overwater flying, where most pilots become very deliberate about their fuel reserves, their weather assessment, their emergency equipment, and their go/no-go decisions. The Bass Strait crossing sits below that threshold for many pilots, and the result is that it sometimes gets treated with a degree of informality that the conditions do not warrant. The fuel question is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is more nuanced than it first appears. A Cessna 182, the type Frederick Valentich was flying in 1978, has a usable fuel capacity that gives it a range of roughly 1,400 kilometres under standard conditions. The Bass Strait crossing is well within that range, but range figures are calculated under specific conditions. No headwind, standard temperature, standard altitude, engine performing nominally. In practice, a pilot crossing Bass Strait might be dealing with a headwind that adds 30 or 40 minutes to the crossing time, or they might be flying at a lower altitude to stay below cloud, which increases fuel consumption, or they might have diverted slightly from their planned track to avoid weather, adding distance they had not budgeted for. None of these things individually is catastrophic, but they can combine in ways that turn a comfortable fuel margin into a much tighter one, and over open water with no airfield available for an intermediate landing, a tight fuel margin becomes a serious problem very quickly. The weather forecasting difficulty in the Bass Strait region compounds this. As touched on in the context of maritime crossings, the strait has a documented tendency to develop localised weather systems that the regional forecast does not fully capture. For a ship, a deteriorating weather system is a serious problem, but usually not immediately fatal. The vessel can heave to, reduce speed, and weight. For a light aircraft, a weather system that develops faster than forecast can close off the options very quickly. A pilot who departs on a forecast that shows improving conditions may find, 40 minutes into the crossing with nothing but grey water in every direction, that the cloud base has dropped and the visibility is reduced in ways that were not in the briefing. At that point, the options are limited. Turning back adds time and fuel consumption. Pressing on requires flying in conditions that may be deteriorating. Descending below the cloud to maintain visual contact with the water means flying low over open sea with limited visibility, which is its own set of risks. The strait does not give a light aircraft pilot many good choices once the weather closes in. The 1981 disappearance of a Pipered Cherokee carrying 4 people is one of the cases that illustrates this pattern, though the details are fragmentary because the aircraft was never found. The Cherokee departed for a crossing that the pilot had assessed as feasible based on the available weather information. The conditions were not ideal, but were considered manageable. The aircraft did not arrive at its destination, no distress call was received, and the subsequent search found no wreckage and no survivors. The investigation could not determine a definitive cause, but the weather conditions that developed in the strait during the period of the flight were identified as significantly worse than the forecast had indicated, and the possibility that the pilot encountered conditions that exceeded the aircraft's or the pilot's capability was considered the most probable explanation. It is a quiet, unremarkable tragedy, in the sense that it does not have the documented radio transmissions or the strange circumstances of the Valentich case. But it represents the more common shape of Bass Strait aviation losses. A pilot making a reasonable decision based on available information, the strait producing conditions that the information did not fully predict, and an aircraft disappearing into grey water without a clear record of what happened in the final minutes. There is another factor in Bass Strait aviation that receives less attention in popular accounts, but is documented in the geological and geophysical literature: the magnetic anomalies in the region. These are real features, not folklore, and they are worth understanding clearly. The Bass Strait region sits over a complex geological structure. The Bassian Plain and the surrounding continental shelf geology include formations that produce local variations in the Earth's magnetic field. These variations are measurable and have been mapped by geophysical surveys. The question is what practical effect, if any, they have on aircraft navigation. For modern aircraft equipped with GPS navigation, the answer is probably very little. GPS does not rely on the magnetic field for its position information, and a pilot with a functioning GPS unit and current charts is not going to be significantly misled by a local magnetic anomaly. But the picture is more complicated when you consider the history of the strait and the aircraft that have crossed it over the decades. Compass navigation, which was the primary navigation method for light aircraft for most of the 20th century, is directly affected by local magnetic variations. A pilot navigating by compass across Bass Strait and encountering a magnetic anomaly would see their compass reading shift, potentially by several degrees, in a way that did not correspond to any change in their actual heading. If the pilot trusted the compass and corrected for what appeared to be a drift, they would actually be introducing an error into their navigation. Over the length of a Bass Strait crossing, even a few degrees of heading error can translate to a significant positional error, enough to miss a destination island entirely or to arrive at a coastline at a point far from where the pilot expected. The magnetic anomaly question is not, to be clear, a simple explanation for all Bass Strait aviation losses. The anomalies in the region are real, but not dramatic. They're not going to swing a compass by 30 degrees or render it useless. They are subtle variations that would be a minor complicating factor in a situation where other things were also going wrong, not a single cause capable of explaining a disappearance on its own. But they are part of the picture of why the Strait is a more demanding navigation environment than its physical size would suggest, and they are relevant to any honest assessment of the cumulative risk factors a pilot faces on the crossing. The altitude question matters too, and it is connected to the weather problem in a way that is specific to Bass Strait. A pilot crossing in a light aircraft typically wants to be high enough to have a useful glide range in the event of an engine failure, and high enough to have good radio coverage with the mainland or Tasmanian ATC facilities. But the cloud base over Bass Strait can be low, sometimes very low, forcing the pilot to fly at altitudes where the glide range to land is essentially zero over the middle of the crossing, and where radio contact may be intermittent. The VHF radio frequencies used for air traffic communication are essentially line of sight, meaning that a low-flying aircraft over the middle of the strait may be below the radio horizon for both Melbourne Centre and Hobart Centre, leaving the pilot effectively out of radio contact for a portion of the crossing. This is not a hypothetical concern. It is a documented operational reality for light aircraft crossings of the strait, and it means that if something goes wrong in the middle of the crossing, there may be a period during which the pilot cannot reach anyone by radio even if they are trying to. This is part of what makes the Valentich case so striking from a technical standpoint. His radio transmissions were received clearly throughout the encounter he described, which suggests he was at an altitude that gave him good radio coverage, consistent with the 4,500 feet he reported during the flight. The transcript of his conversation with Melbourne Flight Service is not disputed. What he said was recorded, and the recording has been examined many times. Whatever happened to Valentich, the radio communications aspect of the case does not fit the profile of a pilot who simply got lost or disoriented and flew into the water without realizing it, because that scenario typically does not produce a sustained, coherent radio conversation describing a specific and unusual experience. The disorientation scenario requires some additional explanation for the transcript, and that is one of the reasons the case continues to attract attention from investigators and researchers who are not by any means all inclined toward paranormal explanations. The intersection of all these factors, the psychological underestimation of the crossing, the weather forecasting limitations, the fuel margin issues, the magnetic anomalies and their subtle navigational effects, the radio coverage gaps, the low cloud that forces pilots into compromised altitudes, creates a risk environment for light aircraft that is genuinely unusual. Most overwater crossings of similar length in other parts of the world do not combine all of these elements simultaneously. The English Channel crossing, for example, is shorter and has better radar coverage and more intermediate options. The crossing between the Australian mainland and Fraser Island is shorter and in calmer weather. Bass Strait sits at a particular intersection of distance, weather unpredictability, physical environment, and navigational challenge that makes it a distinctive risk category. What is also worth noting is the role that optimism plays in aviation decision-making generally, and how Bass Strait seems to have a particular ability to punish optimistic assessments. Aviation investigators have a term for the cognitive pattern, where a pilot continues toward a destination despite accumulating evidence that the conditions are deteriorating. Get their itis. It is not unique to Bass Strait, but the strait-specific geography encourages it in a particular way. Once a pilot is committed to the crossing and is over the water, the psychological pressure to continue rather than turn back is significant. Turning back means admitting that the assessment was wrong, it means additional fuel consumption, it means delay, and it means flying back through the same conditions you just came through. Pressing on feels like the path of least resistance, even when the evidence in front of you is suggesting that pressing on may not be wise. The strait is long enough that this cognitive pressure builds, and short enough that the pilot can always convince themselves that they are almost through the worst of it. The aviation history of Bass Strait, taken as a whole, is a record of a place that does not punish incompetence or carelessness exclusively. It has taken experienced pilots making careful decisions who simply encountered conditions that exceeded what any reasonable assessment could have predicted. It has also taken pilots who made marginal go/no-go decisions and found the strait less forgiving than they hoped. And it has taken at least one pilot, Valentich, whose disappearance does not fit comfortably into any of the standard explanatory categories, and whose case remains, in the formal sense, unresolved. The aviation risk picture of the strait is, in some ways, the most honest lens through which to view its reputation. Not because aircraft disappearances are more dramatic than ship losses, though they do tend to produce more public attention, but because the specific combination of risk factors for light aircraft crossing Bass Strait is so well documented, so clearly understood by the aviation safety community, and yet so persistently underestimated by individual pilots that it reveals something true about the strait's character. It is a place that looks manageable. It is a place that has been crossed thousands of times without incident. It is a place that the ferry crosses every night, and the airlines fly over without drama. And it is also a place that, under specific combinations of circumstances, becomes something that a light aircraft and its pilot cannot survive. The gap between those two realities is where the strait's reputation lives, and it is a gap that neither pure science nor pure mystery fully closes. The physical explanations account for most of what the strait has taken, but they leave certain cases standing at the edge of what can be confidently explained, and some of those cases reach further back in time than the modern aviation era, into the records of vessels and lighthouses and the accounts of people who watched the strait from its shores and noted carefully what they saw. And those accounts reach back further than most people realise when they think about Bass Strait's reputation. The popular narrative tends to anchor itself in the 1970s and 1980s, partly because that is when Australian media began using the triangle framing explicitly, and partly because the Valentich disappearance in 1978 gave the story a single dramatic focal point that journalists and researchers could return to. But the pattern of unexplained losses in the strait is considerably older than that framing suggests, and some of the cases that predate the triangle label are, in their own quieter way, just as difficult to account for as the ones that came later. The Loiner is one of those cases. It was a small coastal vessel, nothing remarkable in terms of its design or purpose, the kind of workhorse craft that moved cargo and passengers around the southern Australian coast in the 1930s. In 1935, the Loiner disappeared somewhere in Bass Strait without sending any distress signal. This in itself was not unusual for the era. Radio equipment on smaller vessels was not always reliable, and not all vessels carried it at all. What made the Loiner's disappearance notable was the weather at the time of its crossing. Conditions were reported as relatively calm, not glassy, not perfect, but not the kind of storm that would be expected to overwhelm a vessel of that type without warning. No wreckage was recovered in any quantity that could explain what happened. No survivors. The vessel simply stopped existing as far as the historical record is concerned, leaving behind a brief entry in maritime loss registers and not much else. Cases like the Loiner tend to get less attention than the dramatic storm losses precisely because they lack a clear cause. When a vessel goes down in a documented gale, the story has a shape. It is terrible, but it is comprehensible. When a vessel disappears in moderate conditions without a signal, the story has no shape at all, and that absence of shape is harder to write about and harder to file away neatly. The Loiner sits in that category. Maritime investigators at the time could not point to a specific mechanism, and the passage of nearly 90 years has not produced new information that might resolve it. 5 years later, in 1940, the strait took something larger. The Zealandia was a more substantial vessel than the Loiner, and its disappearance prompted a search effort that was significant for the period. The search found nothing. No wreckage, no life rafts, no debris field that could be definitively attributed to the vessel. The Zealandia simply did not arrive, and the strait gave back nothing that explained why. The timing of its loss, 1940 during the early period of the Second World War, meant that the disappearance received less public attention than it might have otherwise. The country had other things to focus on, and a missing cargo vessel, however troubling to those who knew the crew, did not command sustained newspaper coverage in the way that peacetime losses sometimes did. The Zealandia was recorded, investigated to the extent that wartime conditions allowed, and then largely absorbed into the broader history of the Strait's losses. What is worth pausing on with both of these cases is not the suggestion that something extraordinary caused them. The honest position is that we simply do not know what caused them, and the absence of a clear explanation is not the same as the presence of something unexplainable. Small vessels in the 1930s and 1940s could fail for reasons that left very little physical evidence. A structural failure below the waterline, a fire that burned quickly, a cargo shift in conditions that seemed manageable until they were not. The Strait's currents and sediment movement could have dispersed or buried wreckage in ways that made recovery impossible even with a thorough search. These are real possibilities, and they deserve to be stated clearly. But the cases remain open in the sense that no specific cause was ever confirmed, and they sit in the record as part of a pattern that existed long before anyone thought to give it a name. It is also worth considering what was being observed from the shore during this period, because the lighthouse keepers who staffed the Bass Strait lights were, in a real sense, the closest thing the Strait had to continuous human witnesses. The Cape Wickham Lighthouse on King Island is the most prominent of these. It was built in 1861, stands approximately 48 metres tall, and remains the tallest lighthouse in the southern hemisphere. It was built that tall for a reason. The surrounding coastline is low and flat, and the light needed to be visible at sufficient distance to give vessels approaching from the west enough time to alter course before encountering the reefs. The lighthouse was a response to the wreck of the Cataraqui in 1845, and the 15 years between that disaster and the lighthouse's completion represent a period during which the western approach to King Island was essentially unlit, which is a sobering thought given the volume of traffic using the route. The keepers who lived at Cape Wickham and at the other Bass Strait lights, Curry Harbour, Deal Island, Hogan Island, kept detailed logs of conditions, vessel sightings and unusual events. These logs are held in various archives and have been examined by maritime historians, and they contain some interesting material. Keepers recorded sudden, violent weather changes of the kind that modern meteorology now understands as the product of the Strait's particular atmospheric dynamics. The collision of cold Southern Ocean air masses with the relatively warmer water of the Strait itself, which can generate rapid low-pressure development and squalls that appear with very little warning. They recorded fog that descended in minutes, not hours. They recorded seas that became steep and breaking in conditions that did not seem to justify it, which is consistent with what we now know about how shallow water amplifies wave behaviour compared to deep ocean. Some keepers also recorded things that are harder to categorise. There are entries in lighthouse logs from the late 19th and early 20th centuries that describe unusual lights observed over the water at night. Lights that did not correspond to any vessel the keeper could identify, that moved in ways inconsistent with a ship's lantern, and that sometimes appeared and disappeared without apparent explanation. These entries have been cited by researchers interested in the paranormal dimension of the Strait's history, and they have also been examined by those looking for natural explanations. The most plausible natural explanation for at least some of these observations is the phenomenon sometimes called earth lights, or tectonic luminescence, light emissions associated with geological stress in the Earth's crust, which can produce visible glow effects at or near the surface in tectonically active areas. Bass Strait sits over a region with documented geological complexity, and while tectonic luminescence is not a fully understood or universally accepted phenomenon, it has been proposed as an explanation for anomalous light reports in several locations around the world. Whether it applies here is genuinely uncertain, but it is a more grounded starting point than assuming the keepers were simply imagining things or fabricating entries in official logs. What the lighthouse records do, taken as a whole, is extend the documentary history of unusual observations in the strait back into a period well before radar, before aviation, before the triangle framing, and before the cultural context that shaped how such reports were interpreted in later decades. A lighthouse keeper in 1893 writing about an unusual light over the water was not thinking in terms of UFOs, because that conceptual category did not exist yet. He was simply recording what he saw in the matter-of-fact language of someone whose job required accurate observation. That does not make the observation proof of anything extraordinary, but it does make it harder to dismiss as the product of a particular cultural moment or media environment. The geographical position of King Island itself is central to understanding why so many of these cases cluster in the western Bass Strait. The island sits directly in the path of weather systems moving eastward through the roaring 40s, which means it receives the full force of southern ocean swells and winds before they have been moderated by the shallow water of the strait's interior. The reefs surrounding the island extend well below the surface, and in some areas are not fully charted even today to the standard that modern navigation requires. The Navarine Reef system to the north and northwest of the island has claimed multiple vessels over the years, and the approach from the west, which is the approach that vessels coming from South Australia or Western Australia would have used historically, requires navigating through a stretch of water where the margin for error is genuinely small. The island is not a trap in any intentional sense, but its geometry relative to the prevailing weather and the main shipping routes created conditions in which vessels that made even modest navigational errors could find themselves in serious difficulty before they had time to correct. The King Island Museum holds records of more than 60 documented shipwrecks in the waters surrounding the island. 60 is a number that deserves a moment. That is not a rough estimate or a figure padded with minor groundings. It represents vessels that were lost, in most cases with significant loss of life, in a relatively small area of water around a single island that is only 64 kilometres long. When you think about the geographic concentration that represents, and about the fact that this record extends from the early colonial period through to the 20th century, it becomes clear that the Western Bass Strait is not merely a place with a dramatic reputation. It is a place with a documented, quantifiable history of maritime loss that would be remarkable in any context. What the pre-triangle cases like the Luina and the Zealandia add to this picture is a sense of continuity. The strait did not become dangerous in the 1970s when journalists began writing about it. It did not acquire its character from the Valentich disappearance or from the media attention that followed. The losses that gave rise to the Triangle label were the latest chapter in a history that stretched back to the earliest European navigation of the region, and in some respects the 20th century cases were less catastrophic in terms of raw numbers than the 19th century ones, simply because improvements in vessel design, navigation technology, and weather forecasting had reduced the frequency of the worst kinds of mass casualty events. The Cataraki's loss of 399 lives in 1845 has never been approached since. But the pattern of individual vessels and aircraft disappearing without complete explanation continued, and it continued across a wide enough range of vessel types, weather conditions, and time periods that it resists easy reduction to a single cause. The lighthouse keepers watched all of this from their stone towers, logging what they could see and noting what they could not explain, and their records now sit in archives, where they are read mostly by historians and researchers who are looking for exactly the kind of continuity that those records provide. The strait they observed is the same strait that exists today. Same shallow water, same roaring 40s, same collision of air masses, same reefs around King Island. The technology surrounding it has changed enormously. The understanding of its physical behaviour has improved significantly. But the fundamental character of the place, the thing that made a lighthouse keeper in 1893 reach for his pen to record something he could not account for, has not changed in any essential way. And that continuity between the historical record and the present day is part of what makes the more recent and more publicised cases worth examining alongside the older ones, because they are not separate phenomena. They are expressions of the same place, across different eras, producing the same kind of unresolved questions, which brings the story naturally toward the dimension of those questions that has attracted the most public attention in recent decades. Not the geology, not the meteorology, not the historical shipping records, but the reports that sit at the edge of what conventional explanation can comfortably reach. So let us talk about the UFO reports. Not because they represent the most likely explanation for what happens in Bass Strait, but because they are part of the documented record of this place, and ignoring them entirely would mean ignoring something that a significant number of credible witnesses, pilots, fishermen, maritime workers, people whose professional lives depend on accurate observation, have put on record over several decades. The honest approach is not to accept these accounts uncritically, and it is not to dismiss them reflexively. It is to look at what was actually reported, when, and by whom, and then to think carefully about what range of explanations might account for what those people saw. The broader regional context matters here. In 1966, at Westall High School in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne, something happened that has never been fully explained and has never gone away as a subject of serious inquiry. On the morning of April 6th, more than 200 students and several teachers reported seeing one or more disc-shaped objects descend into a nearby field, remain on the ground briefly, and then rise and depart at speed. Multiple witnesses described the same basic shape and behaviour. The event was reported to authorities, and the official response was, by most accounts, to discourage further discussion rather than to investigate transparently. What actually happened at Westall remains genuinely unresolved. The point in raising it here is not to use it as evidence of anything in the Bass Strait specifically, but to establish that the late 1960s and the 1970s in southeastern Australia were a period in which unusual aerial observations were being made with some regularity, by people in a range of circumstances, and that this regional pattern provides context for the reports that would later emerge from the strait itself. During the 1970s and into the 1980s, fishermen working the waters between the Victorian coast and Tasmania reported lights that behaved in ways they found difficult to account for. Some of these reports described lights that moved horizontally at high speed and then stopped abruptly, which is not consistent with conventional aircraft behaviour. Others described lights that appeared to descend toward the water and then vanish, either by entering the water or simply by going out, like a switch being thrown. A number of these accounts came from commercial fishermen who had spent years on the strait and who were, by their own description, not given to unusual interpretations of what they observed. One account from the mid-1970s, documented in a regional newspaper at the time, described a crew of 3 men on a crayfish boat who watched a large orange light hover approximately 200 metres above the water for several minutes before accelerating away to the northwest and disappearing. The men noted that their radio experienced interference during the period when the light was stationary, and that the interference ceased when the light departed. That is a specific, concrete detail that is hard to dismiss than a vague description of a light in the sky, and it is the kind of detail that appears in multiple independent accounts from the region during this period. Pilots flying the strait also reported unusual observations, and these are worth taking seriously for the same reason that the fishermen's accounts are worth taking seriously. People who fly regularly develop a very clear mental model of what belongs in the sky around them, and when something does not fit that model, they tend to notice it precisely and report it carefully. Several pilots flying between Melbourne and Hobart during the 1970s described encounters with lights that paced their aircraft for periods of several minutes before departing. In at least 2 documented cases, the pilots reported that their instruments behaved erratically during these encounters, compass needles moving in ways that did not correspond to the aircraft's actual heading, altimeter readings that fluctuated without apparent cause. These reports were filed with aviation authorities and are part of the documented record. They were not widely publicised at the time, and they did not receive the kind of investigation that the Valentich case would later generate, but they exist. What makes the Valentich case so central to any discussion of Bass Strait and unusual phenomena is precisely that it combines all of these elements: the pilot's own report, the instrument anomalies he described, the unusual object above him, with a documented ATC transcript and a complete absence of any physical trace of the aircraft or the pilot afterward. The 1978 period in which Valentich disappeared was, as mentioned in examining that case, a period of heightened UFO reporting across Australia more broadly. In the weeks surrounding his disappearance, there were multiple reports from different parts of the country describing disc-shaped objects, unusual lights, and aerial phenomena that did not correspond to known aircraft. Some researchers have argued that this regional pattern of sightings in late 1978 is significant, that Valentich's encounter should be understood not as an isolated event, but as one data point in a broader pattern of activity during that period. Others have argued that the heightened public awareness of UFO reports during that time made people more likely to interpret ambiguous observations in those terms, and that the clustering of reports around Valentich's disappearance reflects media influence as much as anything else. Both of these positions have some merit, and neither can be definitively proved or disproved with the available evidence. One explanation that deserves more attention than it typically receives in popular accounts of the Bass Strait Triangle is the phenomenon known as Earth lights, or more formally tectonic stress luminescence. The idea, developed primarily by researchers including Paul Devereux in Britain and Michael Persinger in Canada, is that geological stress in fault zones can produce electromagnetic effects at the surface, including visible light phenomena. Bass Strait sits above a geologically active region. The strait itself was formed by the separation of Tasmania from the Australian mainland, a process that involved significant tectonic activity, and the region retains geological structures associated with that history. There are documented fault systems beneath the strait, and the area experiences occasional seismic activity, most of it minor. The Earthlights hypothesis would suggest that some portion of the anomalous light reports from the strait, particularly those describing lights that appear to hover, move slowly, and then accelerate or disappear, could be explained by electromagnetic phenomena generated by geological stress in the underlying rock. This is not a fringe idea in the sense of having no scientific basis. There is laboratory evidence that stressed rock can produce electromagnetic fields, and there are documented cases from other geologically active regions where light phenomena have been observed in connection with seismic events. Whether it applies to Bass Strait specifically, and whether it accounts for any meaningful proportion of the reports from the region, is genuinely uncertain. But it is a more grounded starting point than either dismissing all the reports or accepting the more dramatic interpretations. The magnetic anomalies of the Bass Strait region are a related and somewhat underappreciated part of this picture. As discussed in the context of aviation hazards, the strait contains real, documented magnetic variations caused by the underlying geology. These variations are not dramatic enough to cause compass failure in a properly functioning modern aircraft, but they are real, they are measurable, and they mean that the strait is not magnetically neutral in the way that most of the surrounding region is. For older aircraft with less sophisticated navigation equipment, operating in conditions of low visibility or spatial disorientation, even modest compass variation can compound an already dangerous situation. And for the Earthlights hypothesis, the same geological structures that produce magnetic anomalies are also the structures most likely to be associated with tectonic stress. The two phenomena, magnetic variation and anomalous light reports, may share a common geological cause without either one being particularly dramatic on its own. It is worth being very direct about what the evidence does and does not support. There is no physical evidence, no recovered material, no verified photograph, no instrument recording that demonstrates the presence of any craft of non-human origin in Bass Strait or anywhere else. The UFO reports from the region are real in the sense that real people made them, and they are documented in real records. But a report of something unusual is not the same as evidence of what that something was. The honest position is that some of what was reported remains unexplained, and that unexplained does not mean inexplicable in principle. It means that the explanation has not yet been found, or that the available information is insufficient to determine which of several possible explanations is correct. That is a genuinely uncomfortable position to sit with, because the human mind tends to prefer resolution over ambiguity, and the popular culture around topics like this tends to push strongly toward the most dramatic resolution available. But intellectual honesty requires resisting that push, at least until the evidence actually supports a specific conclusion. What the reports do collectively suggest, taken at face value and without overinterpretation, is that something in the Bass Strait environment, possibly a combination of the geological, meteorological, and electromagnetic conditions unique to the region, produces visual phenomena that observers find difficult to account for using conventional categories. Whether those phenomena are natural, technological, or something else is not established. Whether they have any causal connection to the disappearances of aircraft and vessels in the region is also not established. The correlation between the area where unusual lights are reported and the area where disappearances cluster is real, but correlation is not causation, and the same geographic area that produces the light reports is also the same geographic area where the physical hazards of the strait are most concentrated. Separating the signal from the noise in a situation like this requires more controlled data than currently exists. What is perhaps most interesting about the Bass Strait UFO reports, taken as a body of evidence, is not what they prove but what they reveal about the strait as a perceptual environment. This is a place where visibility can change within minutes, where the boundary between water and sky can become indistinct in fog or low cloud, where bioluminescence in the water can produce unexpected light effects at the surface, where the roaring 40s create atmospheric conditions that can generate optical phenomena like superior mirages and light pillars under the right circumstances. A superior mirage over Bass Strait can make a distant vessel appear to float above the horizon, or can produce the image of a landmass that is not actually visible from the observer's position. Light pillars, caused by ice crystals in the upper atmosphere reflecting light sources below, can create vertical columns of light that have no obvious source from the observer's perspective. Neither of these phenomena is exotic or unexplained in meteorological terms, but both of them can look extremely unusual to someone who has not encountered them before and does not know what they are looking at. The strait is, in other words, a place that is physically capable of producing genuine perceptual surprises, independent of anything that requires extraordinary explanation. That does not account for all the reports. It does not account for the instrument anomalies, or for the cases where multiple independent observers reported the same object from different positions, or for the cases where the reported behaviour of the light or object was sufficiently specific and unusual that atmospheric optics seem an inadequate explanation. Those cases remain in a category of genuine uncertainty, and they deserve to stay there rather than being forced prematurely into either a conventional or an unconventional explanation. The Bass Strait has a long history of producing situations that resist tidy resolution, and the UFO reports are, in that sense, entirely consistent with the character of the place. What the reports also do is add a human dimension to the strait's history that the meteorological and geological explanations, accurate as they are, do not fully capture. The fishermen who watched a light hover over the water and reached for their logbooks, the pilots who described something pacing their aircraft and then filed reports that were quietly filed away, the lighthouse keepers who recorded unusual observations in the matter-of-fact language of professional duty, all of these people were responding to something they experienced as real and as genuinely outside their ordinary frame of reference. Whatever that something was in each case, the experience was real, and the record of it is real, and it forms part of the documentary history of a stretch of water that has been generating unresolved questions for as long as people have been crossing it. The strait does not offer easy answers in this dimension, any more than it does in the others. The search for physical evidence continues, in the sense that researchers and investigators continue to examine the documented cases and to look for patterns that might illuminate what has been happening here across the decades. And while the UFO framing captures the public imagination most readily, the more interesting question may be a simpler one. What is it about this particular piece of water, this particular convergence of geography and geology and weather, that makes it so consistently productive of experiences that the people who have them cannot fully explain? The answer to that question, if it exists, probably lies not in any single dramatic revelation, but in the patient accumulation of detail from many different directions, meteorological, geological, historical, and yes, anecdotal, and in the willingness to hold uncertainty honestly rather than resolving it artificially, which is, in many ways, exactly what the search and rescue operations that follow each new disappearance attempt to do, working with the information available and the technology at hand in one of the most challenging maritime environments in the Southern Hemisphere. And so when something does go missing in Bass Strait, the question of what happened almost immediately becomes entangled with a second, equally difficult question: how do you find it? The Australian Maritime Safety Authority, known as AMSA, is the body responsible for coordinating search and rescue operations in Australian waters, and the Joint Rescue Coordination Centre in Canberra, the JRCC, handles the operational management of maritime and aviation search efforts across an enormous area of ocean. Bass Strait falls within their jurisdiction, and the JRCC has managed more searches in that corridor than most people would guess from the outside. The strait looks manageable on a map. It is not a vast oceanic expanse. It is not the mid-Pacific or the Southern Ocean at its widest. It is a defined, relatively compact body of water between two known coastlines, and yet operationally, it is one of the more challenging search environments in the Southern Hemisphere, for reasons that are worth understanding in some detail. A typical Bass Strait search begins with a last known position, which is sometimes precise, and sometimes not. If the missing vessel or aircraft had been in radio contact with a shore station or air traffic control, there may be a reasonably accurate fix. If it disappeared without a distress call, which happens more often than it should, the last known position might be an estimated departure point and a planned route, which narrows things down considerably less than you might hope. From that starting point, the JRCC begins drift modelling, which is the process of calculating where a vessel, a person in the water, or floating debris might have moved in the time since the disappearance, given the currents, the wind, and the sea state at the time. Drift modelling has become considerably more sophisticated over the past 2 decades, and AMSA uses a system called SAR-MAP, which integrates oceanographic data, wind data, and leeway calculations for different types of objects to produce probability zones, areas of the search region ranked by their statistical likelihood of containing the missing subject. It sounds precise, and in some respects it is, but the strait introduces complications that degrade the accuracy of even good models. The currents in Bass Strait are not simple or uniform. There is the eastward flow driven by the prevailing westerly winds, but there are also tidal currents that reverse direction every 6 hours, localised eddies around the islands and banks, and the influence of freshwater outflow from rivers on the Victorian and Tasmanian coasts. All of these interact in ways that make predicting the precise position of a drifting object over a period of days genuinely difficult. A life raft that enters the water near the eastern end of King Island on a Monday morning might be anywhere within a search area of several hundred square kilometres by Thursday, depending on which current system it catches and how the wind shifts over those 4 days. The aircraft and vessel coverage of a major Bass Strait search is substantial. AMSA can call on Challenger and Hercules fixed-wing aircraft from the Royal Australian Air Force, which fly search patterns at low altitude over designated sectors, their crews scanning the water visually and with radar. There are also contracted civil aircraft used for lower intensity searches. Vessels from the Australian Border Force, the Royal Australian Navy, and civilian maritime operators can be tasked to search sectors that aircraft cannot cover at low speed. In good weather, a coordinated search of this kind can cover a large area methodically. In bad weather, which in Bass Strait means conditions that are genuinely dangerous for search aircraft and surface vessels alike, coverage degrades rapidly, and the strait does not often offer the luxury of waiting for good weather to arrive. The shallow depth of Bass Strait, which might seem like it would make finding submerged wreckage easier, turns out to be something of a complication rather than an advantage. The strait's floor, across much of the Bassian Plain, is covered in fine sediment, sand, silt, and shell material that has accumulated over thousands of years since the plain was last dry land during the last glacial maximum. Currents at the bottom of the strait, driven by tidal action and storm energy transmitted down through the shallow water column, move this sediment continuously. A piece of wreckage that settles on the Bassian Plain can be partially or fully buried within days or weeks, depending on the local sediment transport rate and the shape of the object. The irregular topography of the plain, shallow banks, deeper channels, areas of hard substrate and areas of soft, creates unpredictable burial conditions that vary significantly over short horizontal distances. Underwater visibility in Bass Strait is also frequently poor, limited by suspended sediment and by the biological productivity of the water, which is high enough to support significant populations of plankton and other organisms that reduce clarity. The practical result of all this is that even when searchers know approximately where something went down, finding it on the bottom is not straightforward. Side-scan sonar and remotely operated vehicles have improved the situation considerably, but deploying them requires getting a vessel to the right location, which requires knowing the right location with some precision, which requires the kind of evidence that is often not available in the early stages of a Bass Strait disappearance. There are wrecks on the floor of Bass Strait that are known to exist but have never been precisely located, because the combination of uncertain last positions, sediment burial, and the practical difficulties of underwater search in that environment has prevented systematic survey of the probable site. The 2016 search for the yacht Diane offers a recent and relatively well-documented example of what a Bass Strait search operation actually looks like in practice. The Diane, a 40-foot steel-hulled yacht, was caught in severe weather in Bass Strait in October 2016 while sailing from Queensland to Melbourne. The vessel was struck by a large wave and capsized, and 6 of the 7 people aboard were lost. The sole survivor, Timothy Shaddock, managed to cling to the upturned hull until he was rescued. The search that followed the capsize involved MSA, aircraft, naval vessels and civilian craft, and covered a substantial area of the strait over several days. The bodies of the other 6 crew members were not recovered. The vessel itself was eventually located, partially submerged and drifting, but the search for the people who had gone into the water produced nothing. In a strait that is only 50 to 70 meters deep, in an area where the approximate position of the capsize was known, 6 people could not be found. That is not a failure of the search system exactly. It is an illustration of what cold water, strong currents, and the physical dynamics of the strait do to objects, including people, that enter it under those conditions. The Diane case is also a reminder that the strait's danger is not historical. It is not something that belonged to the era of wooden sailing ships or inadequately equipped small aircraft. It is present and ongoing, and the search and rescue system that responds to it is working against physical conditions that have not changed simply because the technology has improved. The roaring 40s still funnel through the gap. The shallow water still amplifies wave height. The weather still develops faster than the forecasts sometimes anticipate. The currents still move things in ways that drift models can only approximate. There is something worth pausing on in the relationship between the strait's reputation for mystery and the practical reality of what search and rescue operations encounter there. The popular narrative around the Bass Strait Triangle tends to emphasize the inexplicable. The cases where no wreckage was found, where the disappearance left no trace, where the official investigation concluded with cause unknown. And those cases are real, and they're genuinely puzzling. But the search and rescue picture adds a different layer of understanding, because it makes clear that finding things in Bass Strait is hard, even when the circumstances of the disappearance are not mysterious at all. The Diane capsize was witnessed. The approximate position was known. The survivor was recovered. and still 6 people and any debris that might have been associated with them were not found. If a well-documented, witnessed, geographically constrained event like that can produce an incomplete search result, it becomes somewhat easier to understand how earlier disappearances, in worse conditions and with less capable search technology, might have left no trace at all. The absence of wreckage in the Bass Strait context does not necessarily indicate that something extraordinary happened. It may simply indicate that the strait is very good at keeping what it takes. That said, the cases where no wreckage was found are not all equivalent, and it would be too easy to use the strait's general capacity for concealment as a blanket explanation for everything. The Valentich disappearance, for instance, involved a Cessna 182L, a relatively substantial aircraft with a metal airframe, a fuel load, and enough buoyant components that some debris would ordinarily be expected to surface even after a water impact. The search conducted in the days following his disappearance covered the probable route and the waters around King Island without finding any trace of the aircraft or its pilot. That absence is harder to explain away than the absence of a person swept from a capsized yacht in rough seas. The aircraft should have left something, and it did not. That specific detail is one of the reasons the Valentich case continues to attract attention from researchers who are not satisfied with the available explanations, and it is a detail that the general observation about Bass Strait's capacity for concealment does not fully resolve. The JRCC and AMSA have accumulated a significant body of operational experience with the strait over the decades, and the people who work in that system have a practical, unsentimental understanding of the place that is worth taking seriously. They are not, as a rule, people who think in terms of triangles or paranormal explanations. They think in terms of drift rates, search sectors, probability zones, and the physical behaviour of objects in moving water. And from that perspective, the strait is simply a very demanding operational environment, one that requires careful planning, significant resources, and a realistic acceptance that not every search will produce the result that the people conducting it are hoping for. The strait does not cooperate with searches any more than it cooperates with crossings. It operates according to its own physical logic, which is indifferent to what the searchers need or what the families of the missing are waiting to hear. What the search and rescue picture ultimately contributes to the broader story of the Bass Strait Triangle is a kind of grounding. It takes the disappearances out of the realm of pure abstraction, out of the world of unsolved mysteries and unexplained phenomena, and places them in the physical world of currents and sediment and weather, and the limits of human search capability. It does not resolve the cases that remain genuinely unexplained. It does not tell us what Frederick Valentich encountered, or where the Blythe Star survivors spent those first terrible hours before they reached the life raft, or what happened to the vessels that vanished without distress signals in apparently calm conditions. But it does provide a framework for understanding why the strait so consistently produces incomplete answers, and why the absence of wreckage or remains is not, in itself, evidence of anything beyond the strait's formidable physical character. And that physical character is perhaps most concentrated, most intensely expressed around a particular piece of land that sits directly in the path of the roaring forties, surrounded by submerged reefs, positioned like a stone in the middle of a fast-moving river. King Island. The name appears in the Bass Strait story again and again, from the wreck of the Cataraqui to the disappearance of Frederick Valentich, to the general pattern of vessel losses that has accumulated across nearly 2 centuries of maritime traffic through the strait. There is a reason for that. King Island is not incidental to the story. It is, in many ways, the centre of it, and understanding why requires looking at the island itself, its geography, its reefs, its position in the strait, and the remarkable and sobering record of what has happened to ships and aircraft that came too close to it without fully accounting for what it is. King Island is 64 kilometres long and roughly 25 kilometres wide at its broadest point. It sits in the western entrance of Bass Strait, positioned almost exactly where the roaring forties arrive after crossing thousands of kilometres of open southern ocean without any significant landmass to slow them down. The island is not particularly dramatic to look at least not from a distance. It is low and green, with a coastline that in photographs can look almost pastoral. Gentle hills, grassland, the kind of scenery that does not immediately suggest danger. But that impression is misleading in a very specific and important way. The island's appearance above the waterline tells you almost nothing about what surrounds it below the surface, and it is below the surface where the real character of King Island becomes clear. The waters around King Island are among the most heavily reefed in Australian coastal geography. Submerged rock formations extend outward from the island's coastline in multiple directions, some of them rising to within a metre or two of the surface at low tide, others sitting just deep enough to be invisible until a vessel's hull is already on them. The Cape Wickham reef system, at the island's northern tip, stretches several kilometres into the strait and has been responsible for a significant portion of the wrecks that now sit in the waters around the island. The Navarine Reef to the northwest is another of the major hazards, a broad, shallow platform of submerged rock that sits directly in the path of vessels approaching from the west, which is precisely the direction from which most of the historical maritime traffic was arriving when it entered the strait from the open ocean. The King Island Museum holds records of more than 60 documented shipwrecks in the waters surrounding the island. 60. That number deserves a moment to sit with, because it is not a figure accumulated over 1,000 years of maritime history. Most of those wrecks date from the 19th and early 20th centuries, a period of roughly 100 years during which the Strait was one of the busiest maritime routes in the southern hemisphere. The museum itself is a quiet, carefully maintained place in the town of Curry, and it contains artefacts recovered from those wrecks: anchors, navigational instruments, personal items, fragments of hull timber, that together constitute a physical archive of the toll the island has taken. Walking through it, if you ever have the chance, is a particular kind of experience. The objects are ordinary, which is part of what makes them affecting. They belonged to people who were simply trying to get somewhere. The Cataraqui deserves more space here, because the story of that wreck is in many ways the defining document of what King Island can do to a vessel that encounters it under the wrong conditions. The Cataraqui was a 3-masted sailing ship, 802 tons, carrying 369 emigrants from Liverpool to Melbourne. Families mostly, people who had paid for passage to a new life in the colony of Victoria. She was also carrying a crew of about 46, making the total number of people aboard somewhere around 415. In the early hours of August 4th, 1845, the Cataraqui struck a reef off the southwestern coast of King Island in darkness, in heavy seas, and in conditions that left the crew almost no time to respond. The ship broke apart quickly. Of the 415 people aboard, 9 survived. The remaining 399 died within sight of the island's coast, in water shallow enough that under different conditions they might have waded ashore. The wreck site is still there, located off a stretch of coastline that is now largely undeveloped. The remains of the hull are scattered across the reef in pieces, and the area has been designated as a protected historic shipwreck site under Australian law. A monument stands near the coast, marking the location and recording the names of those who died. It is a sobering place by all accounts, not dramatic in the way that some memorial sites are, but quiet and exposed, with the wind coming in off the Southern Ocean and the sound of surf on the reef that took the ship. The Cataraqui disaster is not just the worst peacetime maritime disaster in Australian history in terms of lives lost. It is also one of the clearest illustrations of how King Island functions as a geographic hazard. The ship was not in a storm of exceptional violence. The conditions were bad, but not unprecedented for the strait. What the crew encountered was the combination of darkness, a lee shore, submerged reefs that their charts may not have accurately represented, and the particular geography of the island's southwestern approach, a geometry that offered very little room for error, and no room at all once the error had been made. The Cape Wickham Lighthouse was built in 1861, 16 years after the Cataraqui disaster. partly in response to the ongoing pattern of wrecks at the island's northern end. It stands 48 metres tall, making it the tallest lighthouse in the southern hemisphere, and it was constructed specifically because the approaches to King Island from the north were so dangerous that vessels needed a fixed, powerful light to navigate by. The lighthouse is still standing and still operational, maintained now by automated systems rather than the keepers who once lived in the associated cottages and watched the strait from the lantern room. Those keepers left accounts of the strait's behaviour that are worth taking seriously as historical documents, descriptions of seas that built to extraordinary heights with unusual speed, of fog that arrived without warning and reduced visibility to near zero, of currents that pushed vessels off their intended tracks in ways that their navigators did not always detect until it was too late. The keepers were not writing for dramatic effect. They were recording what they observed, and what they observed was consistent with the physical mechanisms that the science of the strait describes. The positioning of King Island in the strait is worth thinking about in terms of what navigators coming from the west actually faced when they tried to enter the strait from the open ocean. The western entrance to Bass Strait is not a wide, clearly defined channel. It is a broad, ambiguous stretch of water bounded on the south by King Island, and on the north by the Victorian coast, with the island's reefs extending further north than the island itself appears to. A navigator trying to pass north of King Island needed to clear the Cape Wickham reefs, which meant holding a course that was precise enough to avoid them, but not so far north as to risk the shoals and hazards along the Victorian coast. In daylight and clear weather, with accurate charts, this was a manageable navigation problem. In darkness, in fog, in the kind of overcast conditions that make celestial navigation difficult or impossible, with charts that were often incomplete or inaccurate, it was genuinely treacherous. The island acted, and in some respects still acts, as a kind of funnel wall on the southern side of the strait's western entrance, positioned to catch vessels that had drifted even slightly south of their intended track. The current patterns around King Island reinforce this effect in ways that are not immediately intuitive. The tidal currents in the western Bass Strait region run in directions and at speeds that vary considerably, depending on the state of the tide and the prevailing wind. In strong westerly conditions, the surface current can push a vessel southward toward King Island, even while the vessel's compass heading suggests it is maintaining a course that should keep it clear. This kind of leeway, the difference between where a vessel is pointed and where it is actually going, was notoriously difficult to account for accurately in the era of sail, and it remains a factor for slower vessels today. Several of the historical wrecks on and around King Island can be attributed, at least in part, to navigators who believed they had cleared the island's reefs, when in fact the current had been working against them the entire time. The aviation dimension of King Island's position adds another layer to this picture. The island sits roughly at the midpoint of the Bass Strait crossing for aircraft flying between the Victorian coast and Tasmania, which means it appears on the navigation charts of almost every light aircraft that makes the crossing. For a pilot who is uncertain of their position, whether because of instrument problems, weather, or the magnetic anomalies that have been documented in the region, King Island can become a reference point, a landmark to aim for when other navigation aids are not functioning as expected. Frederick Valentich was heading for King Island on the night of October 21st, 1978. The island was his destination, or at least the first waypoint of his planned route. Whatever happened to him happened in the airspace above or near the waters that surround it. Whether that is coincidence, or whether the island's position made it a natural focus for the events of that evening, is something that cannot be determined from the available evidence, but it is a detail worth noting. What King Island represents in the broader Bass Strait story is something that resists the kind of mystification that the triangle label tends to encourage. The island is not mysterious. It is not located in a place where the laws of physics behave differently. It is not surrounded by any documented magnetic or gravitational anomaly that would explain the concentration of losses in its vicinity. What it is, very simply, is a large piece of land surrounded by submerged reefs, positioned in the path of the most powerful and consistent wind system in the southern hemisphere, at the entrance to a shallow strait that amplifies wave height and generates current patterns that are difficult to predict and hard to navigate. Those are physical facts. They do not require any additional explanation to account for the 60-plus wrecks that the King Island Museum has documented, or for the aircraft losses that have occurred in the waters nearby, or for the general pattern of disappearances that has given this corner of the strait its particular reputation. And yet the island does carry something that is harder to categorise than its bathymetry or its reef systems. It carries the accumulated weight of what has happened there, the lives lost on the Cataraqui Reef, the vessels that came apart on the Cape Wickham rocks, the aircraft that flew toward it and did not arrive. The island's residents, who number around 1,600, live with that history in a practical and largely unsentimental way. They fish the same waters where the wrecks lie. They drive past the Cataraqui Monument on the way to other places. The lighthouse at Cape Wickham is a tourist attraction now, a landmark that people drive to the northern tip of the island to photograph. The danger is still there. The reefs have not moved. The roaring 40s have not changed direction. But the island has also become a place where people live ordinary lives, and that ordinariness sits alongside the history in a way that is itself worth noticing. The museum's shipwreck collection does something important in the context of the Bass Strait Triangle narrative. It makes the pattern concrete and countable. It takes what might otherwise feel like an abstract accumulation of bad luck and gives it a physical presence. Artifacts you can look at, names you can read, positions on a map you can trace. It makes clear that the concentration of losses around King Island is not a modern media invention or a product of selective memory. It is documented, catalogued, and in many cases physically preserved on the seafloor in water, shallow enough that the wrecks have been surveyed and studied. The pattern is real. The question that the triangle framing tends to obscure is whether the pattern requires an unusual explanation, and the answer that King Island itself provides is that it does not. The island is unusual enough, positioned dangerously enough, surrounded by hazards severe enough, that the pattern of losses around it follows from its geography with a kind of terrible logic. That is not a comfortable conclusion in the way that a more dramatic explanation might be. It does not offer the narrative satisfaction of a mystery resolved or a force identified, but it is honest, and honesty is worth something when you're talking about the deaths of hundreds of people across nearly 2 centuries of maritime and aviation history. The losses around King Island were, in the great majority of cases, the product of a place that was genuinely, physically dangerous, encountered by people who were doing their best with the tools and knowledge they had, in conditions that the strait itself was capable of making catastrophic with very little warning. But King Island, for all its documented danger, does not account for everything. It explains the pattern of vessel losses in the Western Strait with considerable clarity. It provides context for several of the aviation incidents. It grounds the triangle's geography in something real and measurable. What it does not do, and cannot do, is explain all of the cases that remain on the unresolved side of the ledger, the disappearances where the physical mechanisms are not sufficient, where the evidence does not add up cleanly, where the official investigation closed its file with cause unknown and left the question genuinely open. For those cases, the story has to go somewhere else, and it does. Because when you look carefully at what Bass Strait has taken over the years, and you try to separate what can be explained from what cannot, you find that the two categories are not as cleanly divided as either the skeptics or the believers tend to suggest. So let us try to do that honestly. Let us try to actually separate the cases, not to debunk anything, and not to defend any particular theory, but just to look at what the record actually shows when you hold it up to a clear light. The majority of the disappearances and disasters associated with Bass Strait fall, on careful examination, into a category that is genuinely explainable. Not comfortable, not simple, not without tragedy, but explainable. The Cataraqui in 1845 was a vessel that struck a reef in darkness and poor conditions near King Island, on a coast that was inadequately charted and without a functioning lighthouse. The cause of that disaster is not a mystery. It is a failure of navigational infrastructure and a night of bad weather on a dangerous coastline. The casino, which sank in 1932, went down in conditions that were severe even by Bass Strait standards. The Eliza Ramsden, lost in 1875, was operating in a period when vessel construction and weather forecasting were both far less reliable than anything we have today. These losses are terrible. They are part of the Strait's long record of human cost, but they belong in a different category from the cases where the explanation genuinely runs out. The Blythe Star is more complicated. When the survivors were finally found on their life raft in 1973, after 66 days adrift, their account of what had happened was detailed and specific. The vessel had developed mechanical problems. The sea state had been difficult. The situation had deteriorated in stages rather than all at once. The eventual sinking, by their account, was the result of compounding failures, the kind of cascading problem that shallow water storm conditions in Bass Strait are entirely capable of producing. In that sense, the Blythe Star belongs with the explained cases. The mechanism is there. The sea conditions, the vessel's condition, the distance from help, all of it fits together into a coherent account of how a ship is lost. But what the survivors described about their 66 days on the raft is a different kind of record. They described the experience of being in Bass Strait for weeks, on the water, in the open. They described the cold, the fog, the way the weather changed without warning, the sense of the water around them as something that had its own logic and its own indifference. They were not reporting anything paranormal. They were reporting what the Strait is actually like when you are in it for an extended period with no protection and no certainty of rescue. And what they described sounds, by any measure, like one of the more hostile environments a human being could find themselves in. That account is useful not because it adds to the mystery, but because it grounds the Strait's danger in something that was actually lived and reported by people who survived it. The cases that sit in the genuinely unexplained category are fewer than the popular narrative tends to suggest, but they are real, and they resist the kind of clean resolution that most investigations aim for. Frederick Valentige is the most prominent of them, and returning to his case at this point in the story is not repetition. It is necessary, because the Valentige case is where the honest uncertainty lives most clearly. The ATC transcript from that evening has been examined by investigators, researchers, aviation experts, and people with no professional stake in the outcome, and the document itself is not in dispute. What Valentige said, and when he said it, is on the record. He described an aircraft above him that he could not identify. He described it as moving at high speed, then hovering. He described its lights. He described the metallic scraping sound in his final transmission. And then there was nothing. No further contact, no wreckage, no aircraft, no body, no explanation that accounts for all of those details simultaneously, without requiring you to discount some of them. The spatial disorientation theory is the most scientifically grounded of the proposed explanations, and it deserves serious consideration. Pilots experiencing spatial disorientation can misread their instruments, misidentify their own aircraft's reflection, and behave in ways that are not consistent with their training or their normal judgment. It is a real phenomenon with documented cases. The problem with applying it cleanly to Valentige is the metallic scraping sound. Spatial disorientation does not produce external sounds that are picked up on a radio transmission. The sound was there. Whatever made it was real in some physical sense. Even if what Valentige believed was happening was a product of confusion or disorientation, that is the detail that keeps the case from closing. The staged disappearance theory requires accepting that Valentige planned and executed a vanishing act with enough thoroughness that no trace of him or his aircraft has ever surfaced in the nearly 5 decades since. That is not impossible. People do disappear deliberately, but the planning required to disappear from a short flight over open water, with no boat waiting, no country to flee to, and no apparent motive that investigators were ever able to identify, is considerable, and the metallic scraping sound on the transmission does not fit a stage disappearance either, unless you accept that Valentich was performing for the recording, which seems like a strange and unnecessary detail to include if your goal is simply to vanish. What the ATSB investigation actually concluded was that the cause of the disappearance could not be determined. That is the official finding. Not that Valentich crashed, not that he was taken by anything, not that he staged his own death, simply that the evidence was insufficient to support any definitive conclusion. That is an honest finding, and it is worth respecting rather than trying to fill with something more satisfying. There are other cases in the Straits record that sit in a similar position, though they receive less attention than Valentich because they lack the radio transcript that makes his case so specific. The 1981 disappearance of the Piper Cherokee with 4 people aboard produced no wreckage and no explanation that investigators found fully convincing, despite the search effort that followed. Several smaller vessel disappearances from the mid-20th century were officially attributed to weather or mechanical failure, but in conditions that were not severe enough to make those explanations entirely comfortable. The pattern of cause unknown rulings in Bass Strait investigations is not dramatically higher than in other comparable stretches of water, but it is consistent enough across decades that it is worth acknowledging rather than explaining away. What researchers who have studied the Strait's history seriously, not the paranormal enthusiasts, but the maritime historians and aviation investigators, tend to say is something more nuanced than either the triangle believers or the pure skeptics would prefer. They acknowledge that the Strait's physical conditions explain the majority of its losses. They also acknowledge that a small number of cases remain genuinely open, and that the open cases are not simply gaps in the evidence that better technology will eventually fill. Some of them are old enough and incomplete enough that the evidence that would resolve them is simply gone. The answer in those cases is not available, and that is an uncomfortable place to sit, but it is the honest one. The triangle label itself is worth examining in this context, because it does something to the way people think about the Strait's history that is not entirely helpful. By drawing a boundary around a geographic area and naming it, the label implies that what happens inside that boundary is different from what happens outside it, that there is a zone, a region, a defined space where the normal rules do not apply, and that framing tends to pull all the losses inside the boundary toward a single explanatory framework, as if the Cataraqui and the Valentich disappearance and the Blythe Star are all expressions of the same underlying phenomenon. They are not. They are separate events with separate causes, some of which are understood and some of which are not, and grouping them under a single label makes it harder to think clearly about any of them individually. At the same time, dismissing the label entirely misses something real. The triangle framing, whatever its distortions, did draw attention to a pattern that existed before it was named. The concentration of losses in that particular stretch of water, around King Island and the Furneaux Group and the waters in between, is not a media invention. The pattern is documented. The question is what the pattern means, and the honest answer is that it means different things in different cases. In most cases, it means the Strait is a genuinely dangerous body of water, with specific physical characteristics that make it unusually hazardous. In a smaller number of cases, it means something that the available evidence does not fully explain. Holding both of those things at once is not intellectually satisfying in the way that a clean answer would be. It does not give you a single sentence to take away from the story. But it is more accurate than either the full dismissal or the full embrace of the mystery, and accuracy matters when you're talking about a place where real people died and, in some cases, simply ceased to be traceable by any means available to us. What is worth sitting with, at this point in the story, is the specific texture of the unexplained cases. Not what they might mean, but what they actually consist of. A radio transmission that ends with a metallic sound and then silence. A small aircraft that vanishes over cold water on a clear evening. A life raft found after 66 days with survivors who can describe the sea, but not fully account for everything that happened to their vessel. Official files that close with cause unknown, and stay that way for decades. These are not dramatic in the way that the triangle label tends to make them. They are quiet and specific and incomplete, and their incompleteness is not a door to anything larger. It is just incompleteness, which is its own kind of weight. The strait holds these cases in the same water where the ferries run and the fishing boats work and the cargo ships make their crossings. The unexplained sits alongside the ordinary in a way that the triangle framing tends to obscure, because the framing wants the strait to be entirely one thing or entirely another, either a zone of genuine anomaly or a completely normal body of water that has been mythologized. The reality, as with most places that carry a long history of loss, is that it is both, depending on which case you're looking at and how closely you're willing to read the evidence. And that is where the story of Bass Strait lands, not at a resolution, but at an honest accounting. Most of what has been lost there can be explained. Some of it cannot. The explained cases are not less significant for being understood. They represent real failures of safety, real losses of life, real consequences of navigating a dangerous place. The unexplained cases are not more significant for being mysterious. They are simply unresolved, and the difference between a mystery and an unanswered question is smaller than the triangle label tends to suggest. What remains, when you clear away the mythology and sit with the actual record, is a place that has taken more than it has returned, and a small collection of cases where the taking happened in ways that nobody has yet been able to fully account for. That accounting, the honest, incomplete, unsatisfying accounting, is where the real story of Bass Strait lives, and the place itself, indifferent to all of it, continues to do what it has always done. And yet the strait itself does not know any of this. It does not know the names of the ships it has swallowed, or the case file numbers assigned to the aircraft that went quiet over its water. It does not know that people have drawn triangles on maps of it, or that a young pilot's final radio transmission has been replayed and analysed and argued over for nearly half a century. The strait simply continues, as it has always continued, doing what cold, shallow water does when the roaring 40s push through it from the west. The waves build and steepen. The fog comes in without announcement. The currents move the way they have always moved across the Bassian Plain, indifferent to what they may or may not have carried. There is something quietly clarifying about that, if you sit with it long enough. Tonight, somewhere out on Bass Strait, a ferry is crossing. The Spirit of Tasmania makes the run between Melbourne and Devonport most nights, carrying passengers who are, for the most part, asleep in their cabins. Some of them have made the crossing dozens of times. Some of them are making it for the first time, lying in a narrow bunk, listening to the engine and the water and not thinking much about what is underneath them. The crossing takes about 9 hours. By the time most passengers wake up, the strait is already behind them, and Tasmania is coming into view through the porthole, and the whole thing feels like nothing more than a night's sleep with a slight roll to it. That is the strait as it exists in ordinary time. A ferry route, a fishing ground, a regular flight path for the turboprops that connect Hobart and Launceston to the mainland every day. The losses that the strait has accumulated over 2 centuries exist alongside this ordinary traffic without contradiction, because that is how dangerous places tend to work. The danger does not announce itself continuously. It waits in the conditions, in the weather patterns and the shallow banks and the rip currents around King Island, and most of the time those conditions are simply background. Most crossings are unremarkable. Most flights arrive. Most vessels make it through, but the ones that did not are still there, in the record, in the sediment, in some cases in the water itself. The Cataraqui has been sitting off the northwest coast of King Island since 1845. Most of her structure has long since collapsed and been buried, but the site is documented, marked, visited occasionally by divers who understand they are moving through what is also a grave. The wreck of the casino, lost in 1932 with all hands, lies somewhere in the strait's eastern approaches. The Blythe Star went down in 1973, and whatever remains of her hull is somewhere in that water too, though the exact location was never confirmed. These are not metaphorical presences. They are physical things, sitting in the cold and the dark, accumulating silt. Frederick Valentich's Cessna 182L is not among them, or at least it has never been found there. That absence is still, after all this time, the most unresolved thing about his case. A light aircraft does not simply cease to exist. It goes somewhere, it hits water, or it comes down on land, or it is found eventually by someone. The fact that it was not found, that an extensive search of the strait and the surrounding coastline in the days after his disappearance turned up nothing at all, is the detail that resists every explanation most stubbornly. The spatial disorientation theory explains the confusion in his voice, perhaps. It does not explain where the aircraft went. The staged disappearance theory requires him to have landed somewhere undetected and then vanished entirely from the rest of his life. The UFO theory explains the absence by removing the aircraft from any recoverable location, which is the kind of explanation that explains everything by explaining nothing. None of them close the case. The file stays open, the water stays quiet. What is worth carrying away from the full history of this place is not the triangle label, and not the list of losses, and not even the specific cases that remain unresolved. What is worth carrying away is something simpler, and in some ways more difficult to articulate. It is the particular quality of disappearing over water. On land, when something is lost, there is almost always a trace, a wreck site, a debris field, a body, a piece of equipment. The land holds things. Water doesn't hold things in the same way. Water moves, and what it takes it tends to redistribute, scatter, bury, dissolve over time into something unrecognizable. The people who have disappeared in Bass Strait did not simply die. In most cases, they became untraceable. The distinction matters because it is the untraceability that gives the strait its specific weight in the imagination, not the danger itself. George Bass and Matthew Flinders sailed through this water in 1798 and 1799, charting it for the first time with European instruments, naming its features, measuring its depths. They were doing something practical and necessary, and what they found was a body of water that was shallower than expected, more turbulent than comfortable, and surrounded by coastline that was difficult to read in poor visibility. They were not mythologizing the strait. They were trying to understand it well enough to use it safely. Every navigator who has come after them has been doing some version of the same thing, understanding the rip currents around King Island, accounting for the wave behaviour in shallow water when the westerlies are running hard, watching the weather carefully because the weather changes faster here than in most places, and a forecast that was accurate at dawn can be useless by midday. The lighthouse at Cape Wickham, on the northern tip of King Island, was built in 1861 precisely because the strait demanded it. At 48 metres tall, it is still the tallest lighthouse in the southern hemisphere, and the fact that it needed to be that tall tells you something about the conditions it was built to work in. The keepers who lived there in the early decades of its operation kept logs of what they saw and heard. The sea behaviour they described in those logs is not supernatural. It is the documented behaviour of a shallow water strait in the path of the Roaring Forties. But reading those logs, you can understand how a place earns its reputation, not through a single catastrophic event, but through the steady accumulation of difficult crossings, close calls, and losses that add up over generations into something that feels like a character, a disposition, a way the place has of being. Bass Strait has that character. It is cold and grey and deceptively busy, and it sits at the bottom of the world in a way that makes every crossing feel like a negotiation with conditions that do not particularly care how the negotiation goes. That is not mysticism. That is geography. But geography, when it is specific enough and consistent enough in its effects, starts to feel like something more than geography to the people who live alongside it, fish in it, fly over it, cross it in the dark. The people of King Island know this feeling well. The island's museum holds records of more than 60 shipwrecks in the surrounding waters. 60. For an island that is 64 kilometres long and home to a few hundred people, that is an extraordinary density of loss. The locals do not find it mysterious exactly, they find it factual. The reefs are where the reefs are. The currents run the way they run. The weather comes from the west and it arrives faster than you expect. These are not secrets. They are simply the conditions of living in that particular place, and the wrecks in the museum are the record of what happens when those conditions are underestimated. There is a kind of honesty in that framing that the triangle label tends to obscure. The triangle suggests that the losses are anomalous, that they exceed what the conditions would predict, that something additional is at work. But for most of the Strait's history, the losses are exactly what the conditions would predict for a busy waterway, with those specific physical characteristics. The tragedy is not that the Strait is mysterious. The tragedy is that it is dangerous, and that the danger has been underestimated repeatedly by experienced navigators and novice pilots alike across 2 centuries of crossings. And then there are the cases that sit outside that framing, the ones where the conditions alone do not seem to account for the outcome, where the evidence is incomplete in ways that cannot be attributed simply to the passage of time or the difficulty of searching cold water. Those cases are real. They are a small fraction of the Strait's full history of loss, but they are real, and they deserve to be held carefully without inflation and without dismissal. What the Strait offers, in the end, is not an answer. It offers a record. A long, cold, detailed record of what happens when human beings try to cross a particular stretch of water at the bottom of the world, and what the water does in return. Most of the record is legible, some of it is not. And the parts that are not legible will likely stay that way, because the evidence that would make them legible is either gone or was never recoverable to begin with. The ferry is still out there tonight, somewhere in the middle of the crossing, with its sleeping passengers and its steady engines and its navigation instruments reading the water beneath it. The fishing boats are running their lines off King Island. The turboprops are waiting on the tarmac in Hobart for the morning flights. The Strait is doing what it does, which is to say it is simply being itself, cold, shallow, grey, and largely indifferent to the weight of everything that has happened in it, and over it, and because of it. Some places carry their history quietly, without drama, without announcement. Bass Strait is one of those places. It does not need a triangle drawn around it to be significant. The significance is already there, in the water, in the record, in the silence that followed the last transmission of a young pilot on a clear October evening in 1978. The silence that has never, in all the years since, been fully explained. It just continues, as it always has, as it always will. Thank you so much for spending this time with Life Beyond Seen. If this journey through the waters of Bass Strait was something you found worth staying with, a like on the video means more than you might think, and subscribing keeps you close for whatever we explore next. Take care of yourself wherever you are tonight, and sleep well.